Budget Advisors. Welcome to the first of 7 budget work sessions we have together over the next 5 weeks. Today is March 9th, and this is Tuesday, and it is a work session of the Portland City Council. As we all know well, the challenges facing our city and our residents are many, and they're very complicated. At the same time, we face unprecedented need for services, and we face significant budget shortfalls in a number of our critical revenue streams. There are most certainly very difficult decisions ahead. However, I'm confident that we'll work together to meet the challenges. Our work in January to develop shared council priorities laid the groundwork for these discussions and decisions. In an important sense, I think that gives us a leg up on the conversation. And these budget work sessions have been structured to facilitate more active discussion around these priority areas focused on cross-bureau themes, as well as encouraging joint presentations. Today's presentations will ground us in our COVID-19 response framework and, of course, the values of equity and sustainability, which the Council has prioritized. I want to extend a very special note of appreciation to our community budget advisors for volunteering their time and their talent and their energy to participate in and advise us throughout these conversations. As always, I look forward to your contributions and your insight, and we strongly encourage your active participation. With that, I'll turn this over to Budget Director Jessica Kennard to kick us off with a budget and process overview. Welcome, Director Kennard.
Thank you, Mayor, and good morning to you and to Council, colleagues, and budget advisors. As the Mayor mentioned, my name is Jessica Kennard, and I am the city's budget director. I will be providing you with a brief presentation outlining the city's current budgetary outlook and the process for deliberation and decision-making ahead. First, however, I'd like to take a few minutes of my presentation time to request that our budget advisors introduce themselves to the Council. Our community budget advisors are 5 community members that are appointed by the Council to provide insight and advice on citywide budget issues and decisions. As such, they are full participants in our budget work sessions and discussions. They dedicate a significant amount of their time to understand and engage with Bureau and city budget issues and provide their thoughts to the Council in these forums. Each member holds a wealth of knowledge and experience, and so I'd like to start with them sharing their name and a little bit about themselves before we embark on hours of budget conversations together. With that, I will turn it over to our advisors, and I will ask, I think, Frida as our longest standing member to kick it off. And Frida, when you're done, if you can call on another member, that's how we'll proceed.
Okay, I'm Frida Christopher. Actually, this is I believe my 6th year on the Budget Advisory Committee. I serve on the David Douglas School Board and have served on their budget committee for over 30 years. As well as sitting on the MESD board, budget advisory. I also am co-chair of housing in East Portland Action Plan, and I am a member of the coordinating board for Home for Everyone. So I work a lot on housing issues and education issues. And I'm trying to see who's here, and I've only got, I can't see everyone, Jessica. Can you call on the next one?
Sure. So I saw Terry had joined us, Terry Cross.
Good morning, everyone.
I'm Terry Cross. I'm a citizen of the Seneca Nation of Indians from Western New York State, though I've been in Portland for over 40 years. I'm the only wanderer in my family, so I go back to Western New York a lot. I'm the founder and senior advisor at the National Indian Child Welfare Association that's headquartered in Portland. And I'm a licensed clinical social worker, or trained as a child and family therapist. And I also am a commissioner on the HEC, the Oregon's Higher Education Coordinating Commission, and very pleased to join this group to work on some local issues here with you. Thank you.
I think we'll go to Kevin Rogers next.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. My name is Kevin Rogers, and I am currently serving as the CFO of Disability Rights Oregon here in Portland. My background is mostly finance, accounting, and budgeting, and I've been on this board for a little less than a year. I'm looking forward to adding input and learning more about what we're doing and how we're going forward.
And then Andrea Peluso, I think, has joined.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Andrea Peluso. In my regular life, I'm the executive director of Family Forward Oregon and Family Forward Action, and we organize mothers and caregivers and advocate for policies to support care and caregiving. I'm also the mother of 2 teenagers, almost 14 and 16, and I think this is my third budget cycle, although I've yet to have like a normal one. I joined midway through the first year. Last year was what it was, and this year is what it is. So anyway, but I'm excited to learn and give feedback in this process.
And finally, our fifth advisor, Sho Dozono, who is also a longtime advisor. And Sho, I think you're muted. I see your, let's see. Oh, it's not working today, but you can hear and see everything. Okay.
And if I could suggest, Sho, if you have a question that you want to ask, or if there's something else you want to communicate, just put it in the chat, and Director Kennard and I will watch for that to make sure that if you have a question or a comment, that we get it out there. It's good to have you here.
All right. Thank you, advisors. And I share the gratitude expressed by the mayor for your dedicated service to these important issues. So as we look at our agenda, I'll begin today by orienting you all to some of the logistics around what is to come, beginning with an overview of the budget work sessions and how these discussions fit into our budget decision-making calendar. I will then provide a high-level overview of our city's budgetary outlook and suggest some strategies to consider as you are thinking about aligning your priorities with limited available resources. As we've discussed before, the council typically spends a majority of their time discussing options to allocate the city's general fund discretionary resource. Much of the work sessions and decision points over the next few weeks will focus on general fund allocations. As such, I will also provide an overview of the general fund. Before we get started, some logistics. Last week, the City Budget Office published our annual reviews and recommendations, which are available on our website. And as Council Office staff have requested, we've also printed and bound hard copies, which were delivered either to City Hall or to Council residences as requested by your staff. Additionally, we requested printing and distribution to prepare our typical work session binders for distribution, which should have arrived over the weekend. And if you did not receive either of these materials as intended or desired, please just put it in the chat and we'll ensure proper delivery. The work session binders are organized to align with the work session schedule and have a tab for each work session meeting. Inside of each tab, you will find pertinent CBO review information related to that day's topics and hard copies of those presentations that were available as of last week. Future presentation materials will be shared each Monday morning before the week's presentations begin. Please let us know if you have any questions or informational needs. And I think during the course of these presentations, we may proceed with sort of our typical Zoom protocol, which is raising your hand using the hand raise function in Zoom. If, obviously as the presenters are typically not able to keep track of the chat, Mayor, if you'll just flag for us and go ahead and interrupt if somebody has a pressing question that needs answering, we are happy to pause and address.
All right, Commissioner Hardesty would like to test that theory right off the bat.
Great.
Yes, I just wanted to say if Jessica, did I hear you say that you would be like delivering material on Monday for the week?
The presentation, the presentation slide decks. Mm-hmm.
It would be really helpful for me if I got it on Friday, so I had the weekend to review it, so that if I had questions, I'd have an opportunity to review it prior to the presentation.
Sure, we can shoot to get them delivered on Friday. We certainly will have electronic copies available by Friday. And you can shoot to have the printed materials as well as soon as possible for you.
I don't want to cause you any more work, but it's just better to actually have a chance to review it. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, next.
Work, Mayor.
All right. So, as the mayor mentioned, we have structured this year's budget work sessions to better align with and allow for discussion around council's shared adopted values and priority issue areas. At a council work session on January 21st, council identified the following 3 shared top priorities for collective and immediate focus: developing a new model for community safety, addressing the houselessness crisis, including those at risk of becoming houseless, and supporting economic recovery, which includes economic survival and stabilization. This visual shows how these priority areas are bounded both by the Council's adopted COVID-19 response values of equity and climate action, and by the city's adopted core values of equity, anti-racism, collaboration, transparency, communication, and fiscal responsibility. These values should be integrated into and elevated within each of the issue areas and presentations to come. I've used the icons next to these themes to describe the focus and nexus of our specific sessions in the slides to come. So whereas in the past, our budget work sessions, next slide, please. Whereas in the past, our budget work sessions consisted of over 24 individual bureau presentations on key strategic and budgetary issues within each individual bureau. The framing this year marks a distinctive shift to ground the conversation in the issues first, which often cross our bureau walls. As a result, the presentations ahead will include more multi-bureau collaborative and aligned presentations. We've asked bureaus to continue to highlight key budgetary issues within their bureau as in the past, but to discuss those issues within the context of the core adopted city values in our COVID-19 response framework, and to the extent possible, feature and highlight connection to shared priority issue areas. This shift in focus will mean that there will be less time to hear about and discuss bureau-specific operational context or issues, and the conversation will likely be at a higher level than some presentations in the past. Presentations are meant to prompt group discussions and questions, and bureaus have been asked to stay within fairly strict time limits to ensure time for discussions or questions. Nevertheless, we are a very large, complex organization, and it's unlikely we will have sufficient time to answer all questions that work session participants may want to dive into. So the City Budget Office is taking notes from the conversation and will facilitate follow-up to any unanswered questions that may arise. In the past, when we've run short on time, work session participants have listed their questions at the end of a session, and the City Budget Office has ensured responses are provided to the entire group. Next slide, please. This slide shows the topics and theme for each of the 7 planned work sessions over the next several weeks. We'll begin with 2 sessions that are focused on our COVID-19 response framework and the city's core values, which I'll talk about on the next slide. Next week, we'll discuss the priority areas of addressing houselessness and community safety. We have 2 sessions focused on economic recovery. The first is on March 23rd, where we will focus on the ways in which our permitting, infrastructure, and development functions may help lay the groundwork for stimulus and recovery. Our final work will include presentations from 3 bureaus that cross many of the priority issue areas and functions. And finally, on April 1st, we will focus on economic survival and stabilization, and also have a dedicated roundtable conversation on cannabis fund resource allocation. Sessions vary in length between 2 hours and 3 hours long, and sessions that are 3 hours in length have time for a break midway through. Next slide. Today, for our inaugural session, we are featuring topics tied to our COVID-19 response values. After this budget and process overview presentation, Dr. Markeisha Smith will present on leading with equity. We have a small shift in this agenda for today. So we'll actually, following Dr. Smith's presentation, we will then have Director Andrea Durbin leading a presentation and conversation on climate action, joined by Chris Warner, our Director of the Bureau of Planning and the Director of the Bureau of Transportation. And then we will have a break, and our Chief Human Resource Officer, Kathy Bless, will then be giving a brief city employee update. Our final presentation of the day will come from the Emergency Coordination Center. On Thursday, we'll focus on our city support services. The auditor will begin the day with a presentation on her budget, which will be followed by a joint presentation by the city attorney, the City Budget Office, the Office of Equity and Human Rights, and the Office of Government Relations. The Office of Management and Finance will round out the day's presentations. For context, next slide. For context, this graphic shows where we are at in our annual budget development process and what is to come over the next few months as we move towards an adopted fiscal year 21-22 budget. You can see that over the next 6 weeks, the council is in an informational gathering phase with these work sessions and with community budget outreach events. This is marked by the turquoise color. The mayor is scheduled to release his proposed budget, which is the first iteration of the city's balanced annual budget, on April 29th. Then the budget goes to the full council for approval and finally adoption in June. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to pivot to talk about our budgetary outlook and specific issues related to the city's general fund. You've heard from many folks how the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis is nuanced, how people are experiencing and being affected by this crisis differently, and most notably, how our systemic and cultural inequities are being exacerbated. While the financial impact that this crisis is having on the city is also nuanced. We at the city have certain revenue streams that are relatively insulated from impacts, while others, such as lodging tax revenue or development services fee revenue, are being significantly impacted. We are also fortunate to be benefiting from some new, mostly voter-approved revenue streams, which the next slide will show. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a little bit of the nuance around the city's financial outlook. On the left, we have listed a series of anticipated revenue shortfalls by overarching revenue source. And on the right, we have additional or newly forecasted resources. Development services revenue are forecasted to be significantly and negatively impacted, including most funding streams for the Bureau of Development Services, system development charge revenue in a number of bureaus, and the Portland Housing Bureau's construction excise tax revenue. Demand for new office space, hotels, and multifamily housing in particular have declined during this economic downturn. And BDS expects this demand to remain low for a minimum of 2 to 3 years. For this next fiscal year, the Bureau of Development Services is projecting a total of $48 million in program revenue, which is a 12% decrease from their projected current year revenue and a 26% decrease from last year's revenue. For the fiscal year 21-22 requested budget, the Bureau of Transportation assumes a $75.6 million reduction to State Highway Fund, which is their gas tax revenue, as well as parking revenues, compared to the Bureau's prior 5-year forecast issued last year at this time. Our Water and Environmental Services Bureaus both anticipate reductions in system development charge revenue, as well as some level of impact on their utility bill collections. A number of other revenue streams are experiencing or projected to experience a range of negative resource impacts, including significant impacts to the Spectator Venues Fund, moderate impacts to the General Fund, and smaller impacts to the Solid Waste Management Fund. But it's not all bad news, as certain city revenue streams are benefiting from new or increased resources. New and recent voter-approved tax measures are benefiting specific services. The new Metro tax for supportive housing services is estimated to eventually bring $100 million annually to Multnomah County for supportive housing services. $52 million is anticipated to come to the Joint Office of Homeless Services in this upcoming fiscal year. The new Portland Parks levy is anticipated to provide $46 million annually in new resource to Portland Parks and Recreation, and the Portland Clean Energy Fund, after voter passage in 2018 and collections began in 2019, is anticipated to continue to collect between $44 million and $61 million annually. And as the program plans and prepares for full rollout, it has amassed an ending balance and contingency resources of over $98 million. Additionally, our local recreational cannabis tax fund is experiencing peak revenue levels and is forecasted to have $3 million available in resource heading into the fiscal year 21-22. Also, the state's 911 tax has increased and is anticipated to bring an additional $1.4 million to the Bureau of Emergency Communications. An important part of the balancing equation will be the city's allocation decisions around anticipated federal American Rescue Plan Act resources. With the projected allocation of somewhere near $200 million occurring sometime this spring, this resource will prove essential in meeting urgent city and community needs. While the exact amount of the allocation, as well as the terms and rules around eligible use are still being finalized at the federal level, the current draft language for government services to the extent of the reduction in revenue due to COVID-19. This will allow for some flexibility in solving for revenue shortfalls should council prioritize resources for these services. Next slide, please. Given the disparity in economic health amongst the city's various revenue streams, the City Budget Office recommends that council leverage the new and increased revenue streams to support key council priorities and service levels. We make this recommendation while acknowledging that leveraging any new voter-approved resources must be tempered by the need to fully deliver upon constituent needs and expectations related to that new revenue source. Second, timing will be essential in addressing our current crises. As discussed during the January priorities work session, economic survival and stabilization generally precedes economic recovery. When considering the many crises and many needs, it will be helpful to understand what is most urgent to address and resource right now, and what needs should be addressed in 6 months' time or in 12 months' time. Finally, even while we are relentlessly focused on urgent needs, we must simultaneously keep an eye on the medium and long-term needs and system changes to ensure we're laying the groundwork to build back better from crisis. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to talk about the city's general fund discretionary resource. There are a few things going on with this slide, so stick with me for a moment while I walk you through it. First, at the top of the slide, we're showing our current general fund forecast, which was updated in February to project a $20.2 million general fund shortfall. You can see that about 6.8 million of the shortfall is anticipated to be needed on an ongoing basis, while 13.4 million is anticipated to be needed on a one-time basis. This forecast represents only minor changes from December. Our prior forecast anticipated a deficit of 21 million. And our city economist, Josh Harwood, has told us that there is the potential for larger impacts as business license taxes are received in April. Josh is available on this call if you have any questions around the forecast or general fund economic outlook. The arrows on this slide are showing aggregate general fund cuts and adds as submitted in Bureau's requested budgets. The black vertical line on the right indicates a balance to zero, while the red line to the left represents the need to balance to a deficit of $20.2 million. The blue arrow at the top represents the submittal of $24.4 million in ongoing budget reductions, which Bureau submitted in accordance with the mayor's 5% constraint guidance. Per mayor's guidance, Bureaus were also allowed to request resources from the constraint to be added back, and were also allowed to request limited adds in key priority areas. The green line at the bottom represents the aggregate add backs and adds from bureaus, which totaled $42.2 million. In order to balance to our projected deficit using only bureau requested budget submittals, we would need to take virtually all of the bureau reductions and provide for extremely limited add backs. Next slide, please. So the City Budget Office reviewed the nearly 90 decision packages submitted by bureaus and has issued funding recommendations that get us to that balanced $20.2 million deficit. CBO identified $28.3 million in sources by drawing on the stability reserve that Council created last fall in the fall bump, as well as other contingency resources, and by accepting a net of $16.6 million in bureau reductions. CBO then recommended the allocation of $8.1 million in high priority adds as requested by bureaus. CBO noted in our reviews where requests for resources are likely eligible for Federal American Rescue Plan Act funding, should Council deem that allocation a high priority. While we anticipate that the American Rescue Plan Act funding considerations may be discussed during many of our work session presentations, please note too that we are also reserving time on our final work session day on April 1st, the day of economic survival and stability, to more explicitly talk about ARPA funding options and considerations with the input from the Economic Relief and Stimulus Coordination Council, which is just beginning to convene and is being co-chaired by Kimberly Branham and Tom Reinhart. So our CBO recommendations are provided to ensure consistent and impartial analysis has been conducted on bureau requests, and our reviews and recommendations are meant to help facilitate a conversation around trade-offs given the significant need and limited resource availability. While we're not featuring our analyses in the individual presentations, in the individual work session and presentation days, our analysts will be available to answer questions during these conversations, should you like our feedback and participation. Next slide, please. So I wanted to close by again sharing this timeline of events related to our annual budget development calendar. In addition to the upcoming annual budget development milestones, we have two important concurrent and interacting processes, which are the allocation recommendations and decisions related to federal ARPA resources, and current year allocation decisions related to the spring budget monitoring process, or BUMP. So this concludes my overview presentation. I'm available to answer questions. And if there are no questions, I will turn it over to Dr. Smith to dive into our Leading with Equity presentation. All right, I am checking the chat. I do not see any questions. All right. I will turn it over to Dr. Smith. So let's see, Shannon Fairchild, would you please? Yes, thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Markeisha Smith, Webster Smith. I am the director for our Office of Equity and Human Rights, and also serving as special advisor to the mayor on issues of racial justice and equity. And happy today to be with you all to give a little bit of grounding as we enter into this series of budget sessions. And I'm going to share my screen here, presentation. Okay, that's not the right one. Let's see here. Sorry, everybody. Do you see the presentation now?
Yeah, we can see it. Yes, we can see it.
Okay, that works.
It's not full screen. We've got
Okay,
some
let me,
stuff on the left in the scroll, but it works. I mean, I think we can read it.
okay, it's telling me my screen share is paused, so I think that might be the issue. Let me see if I can figure out what's going on here.
Keelan's a genius. She'll figure it out. Keelan, help us with this.
Okay, how about now?
Well, we can still see it. It says City of Portland requested a budget. There, now
Okay.
it's moving. It's moving. Somebody's.
Okay. That's me.
All right, good. You got it.
Okay, so we're gonna try and go to the show version. So it will be full screen for you. Okay, we're gonna work it from here. Hopefully it's not too tiny. Okay, so this is me. This is my intro slide. And we'll start here. So I want us to think about like how we get ourselves emotionally ready to lead for equity. And equity work really requires us to move and to do that work that in spaces maybe before we've been passive about or distrustful or really sort of insecure or fearing that we would get some backlash for our emotions about the things that we hear and are engaged in. And so we have to sort of think about like, where have been those experiences? Like where has that not been a safe space, right, for us to share? And as we sort of move from the left to the right column and thinking about how we get ready to lead for equity, where are those spaces where we've been able to be active and trusting, where we've been able to be our authentic selves and to share our work in a way that has really moved the dial? Where have we been in spaces where we felt confident and powerful in the things that we were saying and doing, our actions? Where have we felt convicted in that? And where have we felt safe to share our emotions, to have healthy disagreement, and to come to some conclusions that really, again, are increasing the positive impacts for the communities that we serve? And so how has that been encouraged? And I would hope that for many of us, we've been in spaces where this is the case, right? But we know that often moving from what is the left to the right takes time, takes patience. It takes really being in community with like-minded folks. And so as we get ready to lead for equity, where are we, right? Sort of thinking about, what does that mean to you and where are you placed as we are navigating this narrative? So this next slide about what it means to lead for equity, I always tell people that I am more than just my what, and that my leading is about my why. And so my what is, I'm the director for the Office of Equity and Human Rights, right? That's a title, right? Mayor, you are the mayor, right? That's your kind of your what, right? Commissioner Hardesty, you are Commissioner Hardesty, right? And sort of serving in this what role. But my why is very different. And my why is really what leads me to be able to do this work in the name of community. My why are Cadence and Bryson, right? My why are my ancestors. My why, right, are the disparities that I see in communities of color. That's my why. And that is, I think, so much more impactful as we think about how we are leading in this work and how we are situating ourselves to make decisions, monetary decisions, fiscal decisions that really have a long-lasting impact on the communities that we serve. And so in addition to really changing your leadership mindset from a what to a why, we have to think about how we change the conversation to stimulate that change. So how is our discourse situated? Are we sort of in discourse one, right? There's some research around discourse. This discourse one that is very surface level, it's very polite. It's very like, we're just gonna, make sure that we don't hurt anybody's feelings about anything. Are we engaging in discourse two, which means that we are lifting up the hood of the car, right? And recognizing that the engine is broke, and we're not getting mad at anybody for telling us that, right? That we are really, right? We're not saying, well, I wanted you to take a look at it, mechanic, but I'm not really ready to fix it. And that's really keeping us in a discourse one mindset. We have to be willing to change our conversation if we want to change, we really want to have significant change. And we've got to create opportunities to heal from oppression. There are communities that are hurting. There have been communities that have been hurting since the beginning of time. And we don't have to go into the history lesson today. But I think if we're not creating opportunities for that healing to take place, and that is about having that conversation change, then we're always going to be kind of in this hamster wheel. And we're going to have folks coming to the table that we in our minds are thinking, well, they're telling us the same thing that we know. Yeah, they're telling us the same things because there's not been an opportunity for healing. There's not been an opportunity for reconciliation from the harms and the traumas that our systems have imposed. And so how are we as leaders for equity creating those opportunities? And I would venture to say that every time that we gather in a council space, it's an opportunity for healing, right? It may not seem like that. It might seem very governmental, right? Very bureaucratic, very business-like. But every time that we enter into these spaces, we should be thinking about how are we creating opportunities to heal. And not just for our community. I want us to think also inwardly, how are we creating opportunities for us to heal internally, right? And think about the harm and the trauma that certain populations and certain groups of folks may have experienced. And then finally, we've got to be willing to interrupt practices and policies and behaviors that are inequitable. If we continue to perpetuate and sort of sit in and are okay with the sorts of things that we know are inequitable, the sorts of things that we know perpetuate racism, right, anti-Blackness, right, inequity, then we are contributing to the problem, right? And we can't say that we're really doing anything to change the way that things have been done. And so I'm encouraging us to interrupt, right? When we hear it, when we see it, that we're calling that out. And we're doing that in a respectful way, but that we're calling that out. And we're saying, hey, if we have these city core values that say X, Y, and Z, what I'm hearing and seeing is not okay, right? If there's a budget decision that is going to perpetuate inequities for a certain community, we're not going to sign on to that because we can see, right, the long game. And the long game says there's going to be some additional harm or trauma that's imposed on the community because of this budget decision. And so I really want us to be in the practice of interrupting, right? And doing that in a way that is demonstrating our commitment as a city to our core values, right, of equity and anti-racism. I'm getting fired up this morning. So I started talking. I felt like I was preaching. So there's this difference between transactional and transformational leadership. And I would venture to say, and I'm hoping that you can see, I can make this a little bit bigger. I'm sorry for my technology snafus this morning. I would venture to say that often in government structures, we are very transactional, right? We're about an exchange. Here you go, here I go, right? It is very transactional in nature. There's sort of this top down, this chain of command where things happen. Our decision making is, well, that's just the best choice, and best there is in quotations. And we make decisions and tell others what to do, right? And so it's very transactional, right? There's no feeling, there's no emotion to that. It is, it is written somewhere in a policy that was created, hundreds of years ago. And so that's just the way that we have to do it, right? But leadership in equity, right? Leading for equity tells us that we need to be transformative. And that's very different. And so the question that you should ask yourselves today is, am I a transactional leader or am I a transformational leader for equity? And transformational leaders are about relationship building, and they're working within patterns of interaction. They are getting to know the faces behind the decisions that are being made. They are interacting in a way that is authentic and that is real. They're thinking about how leadership is distributed across the system, right? It's not just about one person that's making a decision about something in an isolated silo. They're making sense of information. They are collecting information. They are making meaning of that. They are asking questions. They're not just taking one little bit, one little snippet of something, and based on that saying, that works for everybody, right? But it's about really collectively taking in input digesting that and thinking about what that means on the other side in terms of an outcome. And then there's this sort of practice that happens in learning. So in transactional, it's just like, well, I know it, right? So I'm going to make the decision about it. But in transformative equity leadership, it's about learning. So it's about acting, learning, and planning at the same time. And you think about the mental exercise that has to happen there, right? So I'm moving on something, I'm learning from that mistake, I'm course correcting, going back, I'm admitting that wrong, right? That's transformative. And if we are in a space where we are transformational leaders, that's going to be seen. It's not going to look pretty. It's not going to be in this nice, neat box that we can, put a check mark on. It's going to be something that really shows our dedication, that shows that we are human and we make mistakes, that we come back and we have conversations about that, and we learn and we grow from that. And so I want to encourage us to think about how are we transformational leaders for equity, right? Not just transactional, right? But transformational. And white supremacist culture would tell us that transactional is all we need to be, right? It's about getting to the bottom line, right? But if we are in opposition, right, of white supremacist structures and constructs, we're thinking about, how can we take our time and how can we be intentional about the decisions that we're making? And no time like the budget time in the present is a time to really think about that. So transactional first versus transformational leadership also means that we are navigating with the discomfort. It's okay if you don't know the answer. I learned that a long time ago. And it's okay if we say, let me get back with you. Let's not sit up here and try and make something up, right? That's not helpful to anybody. And so, hey, I need a second, right? Let me do a little bit of research and come back to you with that. And that's okay. And I think white supremacist culture, transactional sort of leadership says that I've got to know it and I've got to be on top of it 24/7. That is not possible. There is a sort of, I think inhumane pressure that puts on individuals to know the answers. And here's the thing about equity. It's ever changing, right? This is ever evolving. And sometimes even I, who sit here and think I'm an expert some days in this work, will admit that I don't always know the answers. And it's okay, right? Because I can do the research and I can try and, collaborate with folks and find out, what makes sense. The other piece about this is it means that as a transformational leader, you're willing to face your own fear when it comes to issues of oppression. And that means also how you've personally been affected. And I know that, sitting in this space, there have been individuals who have been intimately, personally affected by oppression. And so if we're not allowing the space for, just that fear and that, I feel scared about this. I'm uncertain about this conversation, then we really aren't thinking about how we make the time and the space, again, to kind of go back to that healing piece, right? So we have to be willing to face those fears and we have to support others to do that. So for ourselves, we have to step out and be vulnerable. And we also have to create that space for other folks to do that. And often it's about, well, we don't have time for you to process your emotions right now. We don't have time for you to get into your feelings about this. And that's not helpful, right? That's not helpful on an individual level. And it's also not helpful on a community level. We have to create spaces that honor cognition and emotion. So we can be brilliant, right? And we can be sort of, the genius, right? I think my children are baby geniuses, right? And I also recognize that there's emotion, right? And often we don't make space for both. So it's about the academic. It's about what sounds pretty and pristine. And it's not really so much regarded that the emotion is such an intimate part of what happens. So how can we be both cognitive and emotional as we sort of bumble and scramble through all of this? We have to find the courage to interrupt and transform inequitable systems. And here, as I've said, make them into places of opportunity for those who have been oppressed. And what better opportunity to do that than in our budget process, right? So again, thinking about, have you been a transactional leader, right? Are you willing to sort of step into this transformative space? And what are the tools and the resources that you need to be able to do this? And hopefully just this little presentation gives you some courage. So I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about why we center on race. I get this question a lot. And I get it, and I take a breath, right? Because part of me, depending on the time and the space and the day, I get a little bit impatient. I get a little bit like, what do you mean? Have you looked at a history book lately? I feel a lot of things, right? But I also know it's important to really ground people and to have them, have a clear understanding about why this is where we center. And here, let me put this caveat on this. We don't center on race and then forget about every other way in which people identify, right? That would be negligent, that would be faulty, that would not be really doing our work as equity leaders. And so we start with race, we center race, and for these reasons, we do that. And then we begin to think about how does disability and gender and sexual orientation and economic status and all of these other components, how does all of that then filter into this space of race? And so here's not anything I think that is new, nothing novel that's on this slide, but racial inequities persist in every system across our country, right? There's not a system where there are not racial inequities, right? Healthcare, education, criminal justice, employment, right? You name it. I can promise you that if we disaggregate the data, there's going to be race at the center, right? And we're going to see certain populations, certain groups of folks who have disproportionately been systemically oppressed, right, as a result of racial inequities. When we think about why we center race, a lot of times this inflaming racial tension has been a deliberate political strategy to maintain power. So let me just, let me drum up some stuff. Let me make up some stuff, right? As a strategy to make sure that I keep people divided, as a strategy that I make sure that we know who really has power here, right? As we think about white supremacist cultures. So we've got to center race so that we don't get lost in that narrative, right? So that we don't get dismissed in those stories. Not centering race makes it more difficult to understand the impact of race on equity, right? Like if we don't, then what conversation are we having, right? As we sort of start with that as the foundation. Race has been consistently an indicator of greatest disparity in our city and nationally. And some of this information I've gathered from a variety of sources. I want to give a special shout out to Prosper Portland because they've done a lot of conversation as well around why we center race in our conversations. But again, if we disaggregate, right, and look at our data, hey, just look at what's happening with COVID-19, this current pandemic. There are no surprises here, right? People that need to see numbers, look at them. It's not going to tell you anything different than what this very simple sentence on this slide says, that race is consistently that indicator of greatest disparity. Race may be ignored if not intentionally addressed. And here's just a real, fact. Our economy was built on a racist past. So we think about slavery, Native American genocide, racial exclusion, right? It is there, right? As we think about our economy being built on this racist past, how can we not begin to sort of have a conversation that's centered in race and to think about, what that means as we look at indicators, inputs, outputs, right, across our systems. And so I just want us to be really mindful of that. So I put this here, right, as just sort of a reminder for us of, why we start here. And it doesn't end here, but why we start here, right? And then we think about what are the other ways in which identity intersects, right? So we've done some work, and I want us to just, take a moment to think about the work that has been done and the work that is upcoming that will help sort of ground where we are in our conversations. And so we have our citywide racial equity goals and strategies. This is not new information. Work that had happened in the Bureau before I came on, if I'm not mistaken, adopted in 2016. And we have 3 equity goals that were outlined for the city, as well as some additional strategies to go with those goals. I will say as our office has been engaged in our strategic planning process, we've had a lot of questions and comments come up around, do we need a refresh, right, around our citywide racial equity goals and strategies? And so my answer to that is yes. And my answer to that is once we finish our strategic plan rollout, this will be sort of a next phase to our work. But I want to remind us that collectively we were able to come to a place where this was something that citywide folks adopted and have used as a guiding document in their decision-making processes. And so this is one of those grounding sort of foundational pieces that we want to be mindful of, that does exist and is available for us as we need it. And looking forward to the next version of that. The other piece that I want to remind us about is that we had back in 2020, lots of things happening, and a lot of that very good in terms of what was happening with our city and policies. And so we had in May, our COVID-19 resolution, our relief and recovery resolution that came, and really here was sort of centralizing, guiding, coordinating our COVID-19 efforts to think about what our long-term recovery goals look like as a city. It gave our office some authorities to sort of to track and provide some additional support and assistance to bureaus in making those decisions. And much of what we'll kind of see in our budget will speak to some of that as we go into these discussions. But I want to just sort of remind us that we do have this resolution that was specifically situated in our COVID-19 relief and recovery efforts, and doing that from an equity framework. And with that relief and recovery resolution, we had a toolkit that was developed and has been used in various spaces. And some of you probably have heard about it, have interacted with it. I know our ECC, our Emergency Coordination Center, has used it in a lot of their decision-making processes. But this toolkit really, was designed, one, to show the data, right? And two, to really give some resources and some questions and some sort of guiding commentary around how we prioritize Black, Indigenous, people of color, people with disabilities, and other historically oppressed communities within our city, right? So that COVID-19 relief and recovery toolkit is another resource that is available to us as we situate ourselves in this work. And just a little bit about the toolkit and what its goals were, right? To reiterate our current values, legal obligations, commitments, think about our populations who have the most urgent need, encourage relief and recovery initiatives that really, think about equity right at the center and have some performance measures that go with that. And then really providing some easy tools and some technical assistance to folks. And we have been able to really sort of, live into that. And I see Commissioner Hardesty, I will pause. I saw your hand because I can see you're at my screen. So please.
Thank you. And I hope this is the appropriate space to ask this question. As we're starting to lean into really holding people accountable for racial equity goals and strategies, I understand that the pushback has been really severe for employees who have not been trained to understand. It's just like we're not taking something away from white employees to give it to Black employees and other employees of color. And so unless we are intentional about actually addressing that head on, it becomes that same, we're going to drag our feet, we're going to question why Black folks are meeting and white people weren't invited. With all my bureaus, I've had meetings specifically with Black employees, and I've had meetings with women. When I have a bureau that's 93% men, I made sure to meet with the women because, again, it's important that we create those spaces for folks who don't get to speak their truth on a regular basis. And so while we're working that in, there's a severe lack of training on the other end so that other employees actually embrace and engage this need. So I want to just put a pin in this and see if you have any opinions. I think one of the things that the city of Portland could do a much better job of is actually training supervisors and managers and holding them accountable for the equitable outcomes we say we want.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Commissioner Hardesty, for that comment and just raising awareness. And I wholeheartedly agree. I know that Bureau of Human Resources is rolling out some training now that is for managers and supervisors, and looking at like emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence, right? So sort of a series that is really dedicated to some of those, not just like, how to make sure that the time card is right, but really those sort of, personal, right, one-on-one skill set that, folks may not have, right, or may need some additional support in. I know our office is working to create a training in anti-Blackness. We are really, committed to doing that. We've had a smaller kind of presentation with some of our equity practitioners about that, but we want to do something large scale. And so that's another opportunity. We're thinking continually how our Equity 101 evolves. We've been having conversations about what does a 201 look like, and is that for maybe, supervisors and managers to kind of take it up a notch. Right now that you have the foundation, right, we realize that, racism does still exist. Now, can we sort of take that up a notch and, have this conversation about like, what does that mean for me as a leader? And how do I, interrupt, right, when I, am hearing or seeing, right, these sort of things that are happening amongst my employees or in a workspace. So we are working with some things and in partnership with BHR to offer some of that professional learning that we know is surely needed. So
Thank you, Dr. Smith. But let me just say, we may need to bring in some outside trainers, because I'm sure we have that kind of expertise in-house that will, but I just wanted to put a flag in it, because I have seen that throughout many city bureaus. It's just people don't have the tools to be able to interrupt the inappropriate behavior, as well as really champion their employees stepping out and being comfortable with being uncomfortable. So if we're committed to this, we have a lot more training that must be mandated, and that we must measure whether or not people are taking those skills into their day-to-day. And that is not specific to any bureau. So I don't want it to be on your plate, and I don't want it to be on BHR's plate. I think that's a council conversation. So I just want to put a plug in it, because we're never going to move this institution if we're not absolutely making sure that people have the tools to make the changes that we say we want. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate that and your support, right? And thinking through this. And thanks to, our fall bump process, we, as an office, we're granted some professional development funds and are really thinking about how we can use some of that funding externally to bring in some folks to do some of this work. So we're on the same page, Commissioner Hardesty. So very good. Okay, so I'm going to move ahead a little bit here, and again, sort of grounding us in some of the work and the resolutions and the policies and the conversations that we have had. We had our citywide core values adoption on June 17th. And again, that adoption of our core values as being, anti-racist, equity, transparency, communication, collaboration, fiscal responsibility, and really what does that look like? And again, how is that playing out, as Jessica mentioned in her introductory remarks, in our budget, right? And as folks are coming and presenting to you all in this space. So we want to sort of keep that in mind, right? That we do have that as well. And this is just a nice little graphic that Jeff put here. I always like to show this. He's really awesome. And just to kind of give you an idea. So my office goes through each of the budget equity tools that bureaus submit. And what we are looking for, and this is just kind of 3 high level questions. And so this is not sort of the detail that's in the equity tool itself, but I just want to kind of give you an idea of the sorts of things that we are looking for as we review those. So we're thinking about, are there any missed opportunities to advance equity, right? And we're looking at both race and disability specifically in some of the questions that are asked. So any missed opportunities to advance equity, in a bureau's proposed budget. The second is, are there strong equity proposals that we need to lend some added support to? And actually in this presentation, you'll see some things that we've called out, right, that are really good, and some places where we're like, you know, we might want to think about this, because these could be areas of support that council needs to consider as folks are trying to advance the equity work within their bureaus. And then are we thinking about how these investments are linked directly to a racial equity plan, right, that the Bureau has? And so that's actually another one of the questions that comes up in the tool. And, you know, this is, again, very high level. I'm looking for, you know, bright spots. I'm looking for those sorts of things that I can elevate in these spaces as we're having conversations. And I'm also just acknowledging the challenges that exist, right? And the sort of, you know, struggles, particularly at this moment in time, that bureaus are faced with. And I'm also, you know, sort of looking at that with an equity framework that says, okay, given these challenges, are, you know, bureaus, the first thing that they're cutting, like, you know, the sort of initiatives or programs that are driving their equity, right, work, and that sort of sends up a red flag for me, right, or an amber color, whatever color you want it to be. Red might be too bold. We'll make it purple today. I don't know. But, you know, what are those sorts of things that, you know, are making me think, right, have we thought about someplace else, right, other than maybe the work of equity in a bureau, that we can, you know, we can think about some ways to sort of readjust, right, or to make some cuts. And so that's another sort of frame of reference that we're often using as we review budget equity tools. And so just to kind of give you an idea of what our process looks like as we go through these. So the next slide here I have, so based on what we reviewed this time, right? So where we are at this moment in time. This is a slide that really identifies sort of these key areas for funding, or the places where we're thinking about sustainable long-term services and supports, right? And where we really need to lend, you know, some fiscal support to. And the first is, where are the programs and services and supports that are prioritizing Black, Indigenous, people of color, people with disabilities, and all intersections of identity? So where has that specifically been called out within a bureau's budget? So that's one key area for funding that we think is really important always, right? But as we're talking about just this moment in time for our adopted budget process, our requested budget process for 2021-22. The second is, you know, where are there programs, services, and supports that are replacing policies and practices that have perpetuated systemic barriers in contracting and procurement? So we're thinking about some specifics there, right? So how are we really sort of thinking about our minority, women-owned, right, businesses, sort of the MWESB, you know, suite of individuals that offer services in a variety of ways through contracting and procurement. The third is really focusing on bureau-wide equity professional development. So as Commissioner Hardesty, we just had our exchange. We know that Office of Equity and Human Rights has some limited capacity. BHR has limited capacity, even with our collaboration. And so we're really like, where are places where bureaus are, you know, thinking creatively, right, around bringing in additional professional learning opportunities with some guidance from us, right, and support from us to their employees, right? So we saw some things that really spoke to that in the budget submissions this time around. We're looking at recruitment, retention, promotion, right? And so, you know, what does that look like for Black, Indigenous, and people of color? I will tell you, and many of you know, I've facilitated a Black Space meeting since last June, right, when Mr. George Floyd was murdered. And at that point, I didn't know what it was going to be. We just needed a place for people to cry and to try and figure out what we were seeing and hearing, right, at that particular moment in time. What it has morphed into is really a space for Black employees to share their experiences around what it means to be recruited as a City of Portland employee, what it means to be retained. And I'm going to tell you some of those conversations about retention, right? And what employees are experiencing in the workplace. And then about promotion, right? And some of the honest conversation that says, we just don't know how folks get promoted, right? All of a sudden we'll look up and someone has a role and we don't know, we don't have the manual, we don't have the playbook for how that happens. And so I think as much as possible, as programs and services and supports in the budget are prioritizing recruitment, retention, and promotion for our employees of color, that's something to elevate. And then, right, what is this capacity within bureaus to engage in equity-driven practice? How are we continuing to build that up? We have some additional equity manager positions that have, been requested, right, to sort of, bolster that support within bureaus. And I think we really need to think about that. What does that look like? And that's a good thing, right? As we're sort of building capacity. There are other programs, right, that bureaus are thinking about as they are, sort of building out, right, and sort of living into the equity goals that they have established for themselves. And then finally, just near term, and I don't want to lose sight of this, like COVID recovery and relief, right, for our communities of color and people with disabilities. And so how have budgets sort of called out and prioritized that, right? That's sort of near term. So I'll pause there. Jessica, others, are there questions sort of in the chat or comments before I finish up? Because the last few slides are just going to highlight some things that we saw from some of our bureaus in terms of budget requests or commentary.
I'll just say I could talk about this all day, Dr. I'm going to be respectful of the limited time that we have today. But I do want to put a tag in around some of the affinity groups that are doing the heavy lifting within the city of Portland, but have really extremely limited resources. And if we really are going to live our values and our expectations, we need to not have them have to beg for additional time and resources year in and year out. We know that there are holidays where there's an expectation, like CAN, as the city's African American group, are gonna do these very specific programs, but we don't actually allocate resources to make that happen, whether that's time or dollars. And so I'm really concerned that the more we pass resolutions that center race and don't actually put the resources behind it, that we will continue to just have the rhetoric around what we say our values are, but it doesn't translate into the budget. And so, and there's no place, honestly, in our budget as it currently stands to have a line item that's specifically related to how do we support the employees who are carrying the heavy loads around these equity issues.
Dr. Smith, if I could jump in, because I agree wholeheartedly with what Commissioner Hardesty just said. And part of the conversation that we're having in our office is around making sure that our affinity groups actually do have the resources they need. A lot of our affinity groups would like to host events or trainings or other types of opportunities for all city employees or for city employees that are specific to the affinity group, and they really don't have those resources. So that is something that I want my colleagues to know we are actively considering as part of the proposed.
Thank you very much for that. And I've took a little note. So I'm gonna make sure that we are continuing to track that. And our office currently sort of manages what happens with DEEP, right, in our affinity groups. And this has been a reoccurring narrative, I think, from all of those groups. And I agree that we need to make sure that that work is appropriately resourced, right? Time and money. So, okay.
Wait, before we jump.
Sorry.
Oh, good. I was just going to say, I really want to make sure our budget advisors feel comfortable and confident jumping in. And just as I was thinking that, Terry Cross jumped right in. Mr. Cross, take it away.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Dr. Smith for her presentation. Your words are well spoken, and my sense is that it's so important to articulate the dilemma of where we are today. This is a tough area. This is an area that I've dedicated most of my career to, and it's multi-dimensional. So it is overcoming the resistance takes intensive work both at the systemic and the structural level of organizations, and whether it's government or private entities, and that structural change, while extremely important, doesn't get us there if we don't engage also in the racial healing that's needed to move us forward. And when I say racial healing, I mean both for the long-term injuries of people who've experienced oppression, as well as healing for those who have lived the privilege of being in that sector of society that benefits from the status quo and from the oppression. And there's a lot of terms in the literature, and white fragility is one of those. You bump into people who are of very good intent, but who have such a difficult time hearing even a presentation like yours was very carefully crafted so that people could hear it. And it is my part of what I want to say is that this is not these are not goals that you reach easily, and it requires more than tweaking around the edges. So I may be curious in the last slides that you have, because I want to know how the Bureau's projected budgets are embracing the budget priorities that we saw at the beginning of the morning. And it means you got to have skin in the game. And so what is happening at the Bureau budget levels and you can maybe just point out a couple examples, or if you're not seeing it, what can we do to encourage it?
Thank you so much, Mr. Cross, and good to see you. Appreciate the words of encouragement. Yes, this is the mild presentation for the budget. Leading with equity budget presentation. I didn't come with the hard one today. But I agree, right? This is still very difficult for folks to sort of pivot and to think about this. And we are in very unique times, right? And so how can we collectively really, commit, right, to what we're saying here? So I appreciate that. Yeah. Okay, anything else, Jessica, or folks I'm missing in chat? Okay, I'll keep going forth. So I think this is the next one. Yes. Okay. So I just want to highlight from what we have done in our review, and if I missed anything, apologies to my fellow budget directors. It was sort of pulling some things out, what I could see and what I'd heard, and based on the reviews that my team had done. And so these are just some things that I wanted to highlight that you will see or hear about in some way, shape, or form as budget presentations are taking place. And so this slide highlights some work from PBOT, Parks, Government Relations, BDS, and the Water Bureau, right? And so we were, really pleased to see that PBOT is, continuing to allocate some funding around their equity and inclusion program, and Parks, obviously, with this levy, right, spoke specifically to how services are going to be prioritized for Black, Indigenous, people of color, people with disabilities. Government Relations is bolstering support for their tribal relations program. And I'd like to also call out Government Relations and City Budget Office. And although this happened in our fall bump, were able to bring forth a proposal that was passed around a small bureau equity manager that will be housed within the Office of Equity and will provide some specific support to Government Relations and to our City Budget Office. So that's really exciting. BDS in their expansion of their Empower Communities program is really great to hear. And, and I'm saying this too, because these are also some bureaus, and I'm not naming them, specific, right, pointing anybody out, but that have had to make some significant cuts right, and some significant reductions as a result of what's been happening, right, over the last year and some change. And so to see the continued commitment to programs and supports and services that center equity, as I went, sort of shared in that slide around sort of those 3 high level things that we're looking for, that just, that's important, right? That's critical. And that for me demonstrates that commitment. Water Bureau allocating some funds to look at their work groups, right, and strategies for how they can empower and partner with underrepresented communities, right? So there's some work going on there. And then a couple other highlights in BPS. They are supporting some cultural change for their BIPOC caucus and looking at community engagement that really centers race and actually using that to help shape their programs. BES, here just sort of a reality that their budget constraints are going to impact some of their hiring, right? And their efforts, their commitment has really been to diversify their workforce. And so budget constraints that they pointed out within their budget equity tool are really going to impact that this time around and, possibly into the future. BTS is really looking forward to the OMF equity manager. And that sort of was a reoccurring theme across the OMF budget equity submission. And they're really looking at, being able to realign their equity goals and to have some support to do that. And, often in some of our internal structures, it's it may be more difficult to see, right? Like, how does, equity really sort of play out? What does this look like, right? If I'm in technology services or if I, in these specific sort of areas of our government structure. And I just appreciate that everyone really realizes that this is a collective effort, right? And that this does impact everybody, right? Whether it is internally facing services or supports or whether it's externally facing. And so just, even BTS, right, is like, yeah, we got some things that we need some help on, and we're really excited and looking forward to having an equity manager be able to help us move through some of that. BHR, right, is really, speaking to the fact that some reductions, again, are going to, as it is with BES, impact what they're trying to do with recruitment, right? And also just acknowledging that, kind of going back to this piece around training, that there are inequities, right, in terms of what training looks like. And again, capacity issues that come along with that. And our office, does the best that we can. BHR offers, we've done some things that are, collaborative in nature. And so really looking at, what some bureaus can afford and what others can't. And so BHR called that out in their work. And then just one other slide, Civic Life, right, is looking at a proposed budget. And I appreciate the language as this was reviewed. That's really shielding programs, that is protecting programs, right, with the highest impact, right, in our Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities from cuts, right? So really trying to shield that, making an intentional effort that that's not going to be the first place that we look, right? And so specifically, some places that has happened is a diversity and civic leadership program, constructing civic dialogues, immigrant and refugee program, disability and youth program. So they have, crafted that to protect that work. Fire and rescue speaks to the need to increase capacity on their recruitment team, their equity team, their chat team to really better reach some of their equity goals and their new strategic plan. And then housing, right? And I have the opportunity to be involved in some of the early decision making with our first round of COVID-19 funds, just the influx of work that was placed on the Housing Bureau to really be able to get funds into community for household assistance and for rent assistance, and just acknowledging that this COVID-19 pandemic hasn't made that go away. It's just really exacerbated the problem. Like, so it's not like, in the midst of all of this, people are no longer homeless, people are no longer experiencing extreme economic impacts. And so here, right, just really continuing to speak to that, the threat of that, I think is really vital. And then the police, right, the proposed cut open positions could never negatively impact their efforts to diversify. And so there's just been a lot around that, that commitment to diversify, recruitment, retention, all of that, right? And so just wanted to point some of that out, right? And again, if I missed your bureau, it's no slight on you. just trying to, gather some information and to provide some highlights for the sharing today. So wanted to make that clear. So my last slide really is like, what is our call to action? And I'm going to add one piece to this based on the beginning conversation that I had, is one that we oppose anti-Black racism, that we oppose racism in general, right? And specific anti-Black racism here, that we are challenging white supremacist policy and practice, and that we're being accountable, right? That we acknowledge past and present harms to our communities, and that we're committing, as I said, to a process that is restorative and healing. And that I am encouraging you to think about, how are you leading with equity? How are you a leader for equity? And are you doing that in a transactional way, like you go to the bank and take some money out, put your card in the ATM and get something back? Or are you doing it in a way that is transformational, that is slowing down, that is intentional, that is thoughtful, that is vulnerable, as we know that this work is very difficult to do. And I would hope that we are all committed to being transformative leaders for equity. And I think that is my time. So thank you. And I guess we can have probably some questions. I'm gonna stop sharing.
Frida has a question.
Yes, your last slide's about having to do with reductions in the Bureau's budgets because revenues have fallen, which implies also layoffs, and I was reading through some of the data on the layoffs. Are we doing anything with our unions? Because the practice or the way that contracts are written in state law, it's usually last in, first out, and usually the last in are employees of color. I know our school district over a year ago has started these discussions because we don't want to lose our new employees that are employees of color, our teachers especially. So we've already started those discussions on how we can work together so we don't have this loss. Has the city done anything, especially with the looking at layoffs in several of the bureaus? And I'm not sure who should answer it.
Yeah, I thank you, Frida, for the question. And I'm not sure I would be the most qualified to answer that question. So Jessica, do you want to jump in?
So we do have our Chief Human Resource Officer is actually just turned her camera on. She's already here. She's giving a brief presentation later in the agenda, but I'm sensing that you're ready to respond, Kathy. Please take it over.
Thank you. And thank you very much for the question. It is a critical part of how we address our anti-racism policies and systemic and institutional racism. Labor negotiations and labor unions are certainly a partner here within the city of Portland, and we honor the relationships that we have with them. With that said, we have begun discussions certainly with our labor partners on how to address this. This is certainly part of our plan to work with and honor the work of our labor partners. So it is work that's starting. I don't have definitive pieces on how it's going to be resolved, but it is an ongoing question and it is an ongoing value with both the city and our labor partners.
Just one more comment in regard to that, because like I said, over a year ago, our school district had already started these conversations, is that part of, as I see it, there are state laws that actually perpetuate it. We talk about our policies and government, policies that perpetuate it. And I think there's some state laws that need to be relooked at, which may require us as a city to do our advocacy to get changes so that it makes it easier for entities that have unions to look at addressing this in a different way. Just a comment.
Thank you very much for that. Yes.
Great presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. We really appreciate it.
Excellent presentation. If I may, the only question I had, Dr. Smith, as you were talking about various bureaus, you were using the acronyms, and we may have listeners that don't know what those mean. And so I don't know if you would like to go through and actually just say what the name of those bureaus are, so that people would know, or if you'd like me to do it, either one would be fine.
It's up to you, sis.
I'm going to turn it over to you. You did such a fabulous job. I don't want to be screwing up all the work.
Okay.
But it did occur to me that people listening may not know what you were talking about.
Sure, I can do that. I'm going to go back to the slide. So PBOT is our Portland Bureau of Transportation. We have parks. I think I did that one. Government relations. Let's see. Trying to look. BDS, Bureau of Development Services, is BDS. Let's see what else is next. BPS, Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. Okay. BES, Bureau of Environmental Services. BTS, Bureau of Technology Services. Make sure I get these right. The Bureau directors will be mad with me. And BHR, Bureau of Human Resources. And I think, is that it? Yep, I think the rest of them were spelled out. Okay.
100%. Perfect score for Dr. Smith.
I was a teacher, so you know that.
You nailed it. Commissioner Ryan.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. That was a great presentation, and also good job on the acronyms. I was following along as a newer person. I wanted to make sure I got it right too. I really appreciate the dialogue, and a lot of it centered, which I think it makes sense, on the city employees and the city culture. And I was taken with the bullet that talks about parks operating levy. And it's because it's about services that are out in the community, population results when we look, and we definitely have race in the center of that. I think I'm craving for that. I'm craving for more accountability for how our equity work actually lands for results for the residents of the city. And so I just highlighted the parks bullet because it was concrete in that endeavor. So I'm just putting it out loud on the record that I think I encourage, at least in my leadership, and I think this is definitely relational, because when you partner with those on the ground that really have the wisdom, that's where I think we're going to see the biggest benefit for change for our city. And so the more the city gets out of City Hall and leans into the communities that are closer to their families, and as I'm used to saying, families and students, the families out of the community, I think we're going to see better results. So I just encourage us to figure out how our outcomes can be more resident facing. Not to say that it's eliminating the internal work we're doing. This is an and, not an or dialogue that I'm doing with you at the moment. And so I just wanted to put that on the record.
Thank you, Commissioner Rubio.
Thank you. And thank you so much for that presentation. It was really great to hear all these pieces as I'm 2 months into this job. I have a question for you, or a couple questions. The first is, can you talk a little bit more, and maybe I would love to hear from your advisors as well. How is the input and the wisdom from your advisors integrated into the work that you're doing? And then a question for the advisors: is there any project or any sort of specific work that you personally can lift up or point to that is a really good example for us as council to know, like, this is what progress looks like, or this is an example of something we need to do and highlight? Thanks.
And I think you were asking me, Commissioner Rubio. Good morning. Okay, so when you said advisors, I was trying to make sure, are you speaking like to the folks in my office that?
I mean the community advisors. And
community advisors.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have an individual, like within bureaus, have kind of individual community advisory, budget community advisory groups. And we have one, for Office of Equity and Human Rights. And so They, help to provide input specific to like our budget, right? And so we haven't interfaced with our larger sort of budget advisory group here. And I don't know, Jessica, kind of, she may be able to sort of speak to that role a little bit more as it relates to this space. But I know just Commissioner Rubio, like our, individual budget advisory group has been very instrumental in sort of supporting, right, and providing feedback and input on our, office budget, right, sort of moving before it gets to the stage where you all see it, right, and have the opportunity to have discussion on it. And just in terms of your question around like sort of some other highlights or some other examples, I would really encourage you, and I'm not, just for sake of time, I'm going to just kind of say the Bureau, but places where we've seen some really good work is parks. And so really looking at parks very carefully. There's been a lot of really great work coming out of parks that we've seen. And there were also some things that were highlighted within civic life that were very promising. And I say that because there was some specific work to really sort of, as I mentioned, protect some of the programs that they have that are existing that, they're trying to build some capacity around. And I think just that model of how do you do that, right, when you're in sort of this situation where you're having to make reductions, I think is a really good, that's a really good model. And I don't know, everybody's doing really good stuff, but like those are just kind of, top of mind right now. Trying to think of anybody else. Oh, and BPS, right, is really doing a lot around some internal pieces. So I'll leave it there. And don't be mad, bureau directors, if I just didn't call you out in this space. I love everybody and you're doing really good work.
Commissioner Ryan, did you have another question?
No, I did that thing where I forgot to put my hand in.
All right, folks, any other questions for Dr. Smith before we move to the next? Director Kennard had a great suggestion, which is why don't we slightly shift our agenda and take a 10-minute break. I'll get to you in just a sec, Terry. Let's take a 10-minute break now, just because we've had a really good long presentation and discussion. So this would be a good time to take a break. But before we do that, Terry, go ahead and ask your question or offer your comment.
That's more comment than question. One of the ways that communities approach this, I do some consulting across the country, and one of the places that I've done that is Buffalo, New York. And Buffalo established a racial justice task force across the city, and it's both city bureaus, but also the courts, the faith community, all of the communities of color. My role there was to try to help them incorporate the indigenous voice into their efforts. And I think one of the most important contributions that task force made was trying to find alignment between the disparities that we just heard Dr. Smith speak so much about, and what the actual efforts of city government can do to address the specific disparities in community. And it goes back to, Mr. Mayor, your point about, and I think Commissioner Ryan talking about trying to align what the city government can do in community and turn it in that direction. It is very valuable to train our workforce to be more focused on this issue, but unless we actually do something differently, it's very difficult to have that transformational leadership that Dr. Smith was talking about. So what that means is you've got to have more resources in the parts of the city government that tell us what's wrong, and a mechanism to help decide what to do about it. And so that's the only comment that I'd make is my interest in trying to figure out what are the things that we can actually do? And I want to support that conversation.
Thank you, Terry. That makes a lot of sense. All right, good. So shall we take a 10-minute break? Director Kennard, is that what you'd propose?
Yeah, so we will reconvene at 10:40 and we will at that time have a presentation from Director Durbin and Director Warner on climate action.
Perfect. Thanks. We will be in recess then until 10:40 a.m.
right, so I think I'm going to turn it over to Director Andrea Durbin from the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. And I think Keelan offered and Christina offered to help drive the presentation. So Christina Thomas, are you able to pull up the presentation? Awesome, thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Good morning, Mayor, Commissioners, Budget Advisors. I'm Andrea Durbin, the Director of the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and I appreciate the opportunity to build from Dr. Smith's presentation on addressing racial equity, to also focus on the opportunity to address the climate crisis as we build back better. And thank you, Christina, from the Council Clerk's Office for driving this presentation. Next slide, please. This week is the anniversary of when government had to take action to protect public health, shuttering our schools and our businesses. With community, the city has worked to keep people housed, to keep people fed, and to provide relief to our small businesses. And gratefully, we are now several vaccines in, which provides a much needed collective deep breath. As Dr. Smith described, the COVID recovery resolution passed by City Council prioritizes racial equity and climate in our response and recovery work. The resolution connected the three public crises we are currently facing: the pandemic, climate, and racism. Next slide, please. It is my hope that the equity framework Dr. Smith described shapes all of our recovery work ahead, including our work on climate justice. Because climate action is racial justice. Climate action is health justice. Climate action is economic justice. We cannot go back to normal pretending that the climate crisis doesn't require swift action, just as the pandemic we are facing required and continues to require effective action. The good news is that solutions to climate change also address public health and economic health in ways that can reverse disparities for those most impacted by climate change. Next slide. Climate action is also good for the local economy. The low carbon economy is emerging as a major US employer. Clean energy industries led Oregon's energy economy in 2019, accounting for nearly 6 out of every 10 energy jobs. Investing in energy efficiency, transportation electrification, and renewable energy and fuels creates local, good-paying jobs based on the simple fact that we import 100% of fossil fuels used locally. Electrification and renewable fuels keep dollars in our local economy. However, climate change doesn't impact us all the same way. Our frontline communities, especially Portland's Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, are being hit first and worst by the impacts of the climate crisis, much like we've seen with the COVID crisis. And Portland's youth will be facing the consequences of today's decisions for the rest of their lives. BIPOC communities bear the biggest impacts of climate change, and with intentionality can benefit from these opportunities. One such opportunity is the Portland Clean Energy Fund. With these investments, we can create jobs for Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, and also invest in renewable energy and energy efficiency projects that benefit them and reduce their cost burdens. Next slide, please. Economic recovery is an opportunity to build thriving communities and make homes, buildings, streets, and energy systems renewable, more resilient, safer, more comfortable, and more enjoyable. This is all good news. Data is showing us our actions can make a positive impact, and we can all be proud that Portland has been a leader on climate since the early 90s, and we've set science-based goals to reduce carbon. Next slide, please. But even leaders need to do more to quicken the pace of change. Experts agree that we need to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees to avoid irreversible, devastating impacts. The actions we take over the next 2 years and 5 years are critical to our future. What we are seeing is that our emissions reductions have plateaued. While we've been successful in reducing local carbon emissions on a per capita basis of 42% per person, because our city has grown during that time, the last inventory reports show that we've cut our overall community-wide emissions by 19%, as seen in this chart. If we don't speed up our climate justice work, we will not make our carbon reduction goals set by City Council to cut emissions in half by 2030 and 100% by 2050 or sooner. Next slide, please. And as you can see on this chart, if we assume the same level of effort and resources towards addressing climate actions, Our current trends show that we will not meet City Council's climate action goals. The truth is that we need more resources to invest in climate work to support bureaus and partners working to cut emissions, build thriving and more resilient communities to withstand the impacts of climate change that are already here, from wildfires to heavy storm events. Next slide. I'm grateful for the climate emergency declaration supported by City Council last year. I agree it's an emergency. Yet commitments alone won't reduce emissions, and the resources available are not commensurate with the action required. As we've seen from the past year, the city can rally together and respond effectively to a crisis when required. COVID shows how quickly governments can adapt and transform when the situation requires it. Now is the time to think creatively about how to advance the climate actions included in the Climate Emergency Declaration. How can we maximize our role as a city to incentivize less pollution and generate the resources we need, and pulling in essential partners to make this happen? We want to engage with you, other bureaus, and stakeholders, and not wait until it's too late or too costly. Come 2030, I want to be standing with all of you and with community in celebration that we've achieved racial justice, health justice, and economic justice in our climate work. And that is what we want Portland's city climate legacy to be. We've got 8.5 years, and we need to get on track now. The time is now, that clock is ticking. Next slide. For the remaining portion of my time, I'll focus on the climate work that we can do with our current base budget funding. Today, you will hear from two bureaus, the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability and Bureau of Transportation, because nearly 85% of the carbon emissions in Multnomah County come from the transportation sector and buildings, and we're the bureaus responsible for reducing those emissions. There are other bureaus and partners doing important work on climate across the city that I want to mention and appreciate. The Water Bureau convenes several other bureaus to work on climate adaptation and resiliency. Bureau of Emergency Management leads the work on climate response planning and disaster planning. And I hope that Council will invite these bureaus to present more on that very important work in the future. Office of Management and Finance is also a key partner, particularly in leading the fleet conversion commitments City Council has made to have cleaner electric vehicles. We also coordinate with the state, Oregon Public Utilities Commission, Multnomah County, and Metro on climate-related policies and actions. Next slide, please. BPS's focus is on buildings, clean fuels, and clean energy for our climate decarbonization strategies. With our current level of support from general funds, we have 6 FTE that work on climate actions that reduce carbon emissions community-wide and also in the city's own operations. With current budget levels, next year's work will focus on setting building performance standards for more efficient multifamily housing and commercial buildings, establishing EV-ready codes for multifamily housing to make EVs more accessible, and then updating the renewable fuel standard to increase consumer availability of cleaner fuel options as Portland transitions away from fossil fuels. To support that work, BPS has an add back request in this year's budget, which is also supported by CBO, for external materials and services of $53,000 to help us advance the climate work that I just mentioned. Next slide, please. BPS is also looking to cut emissions and deliver real benefits to BIPOC and low-income communities and reduce energy and transportation cost burdens for these communities. The Portland Clean Energy Community Benefits Fund is also a key part of BPS's climate work. And as you will hear about more when our first grant portfolio is recommended to City Council for adoption on April 1st, this community-led, voter-passed initiative provides a unique strategy for the city to invest in renewable energy, energy efficiency, green infrastructure, workforce development, and community benefits. What is important to understand, however, is that these funds have a very strict use and are meant to directly benefit community. PSEF dollars cannot fund the city's broader community-wide climate action plans. But PSEF does offer a unique and welcome tool for the city and community to work together on climate justice. Next slide. The Climate Emergency Declaration calls for actions that the city is not fully resourced to implement. For example, one way to address hotter temperatures is to increase the tree canopy in the city. This is particularly important in East Portland, which has far fewer trees than the West Side. This is important work that Parks and BES would help lead us as part of the climate resiliency planning for the city. We need to build out more community renewable energy and microgrids as well for more resilient neighborhoods. which will be important as we see more storms and power outages. We'll hear more from PBOT about transportation mode shift and electrification work that they want to accomplish. And the future of buildings needs to be carbon-free, which will require more supportive programs, requirements in place, and policy incentives to accomplish. Community organizations are also calling us to clean up Portland's air. Portland has the worst air pollution in the state and some of the highest diesel pollution in the country. And with wildfire events expected to be more of the norm in our future and presenting more dangerous health risks than vehicle exhaust, we know that protecting public health, particularly for those residents most vulnerable to air pollution exposure, will be expected of us. With dedicated resources, BPS would like to establish a program on clean air, working closely with community partners in Multnomah County to improve environmental health and environmental justice. With a cut budget this year, bureaus did not request funding to advance these directives, but that doesn't mean the need is not there. And it isn't just BPS and PBOT, but other bureaus leading work on disaster preparedness and neighborhood and ecosystem resiliency will also need to be resourced to deliver on the commitments City Council has directed us to undertake in the Climate Emergency Declaration. These 4 examples are just some of the unfunded needs we face today. And with that, I'm going to pass to Director Warner to talk about PBOT's work.
Great, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, super, thank you. Thank you, Director Durbin. Next slide, please. Thank you, and Council. Happy to be here. Chris Warner, Director of the Portland Bureau of Transportation. I'm pleased to be here to talk about this very important topic. I will take the next slide, please. So how we choose to get around has a direct impact on the health of our climate. Up to this point, our traditional choices, reliance on fossil fuels and traveling alone in personal cars, really is no longer sustainable. They're warming the planet and contributing to the current crisis. The fact that we've been making the wrong choices for the planet is bad news, but the silver lining is here. Because choices can be changed, we can make better, more sustainable transportation choices. The strategy that I outlined today is designed to make it easy, safe, and convenient for Portlanders to choose climate-friendly transportation options, and to do so in a way that is also equitable and benefits all Portlanders. Portland's climate targets are ambitious because they have to be. The success of our transportation climate strategy will depend on Portland making the investments and implementing policies that are ambitious as our climate targets. Next slide, please. Because failing to shrink our carbon footprint is not an option, we have to put addressing the climate crisis at the heart of our strategic plan, moving to our future. What this means is as we implement new policies, launch new programs, and build new projects, we are always going to evaluate the role these initiatives will play in reducing our carbon footprint. Addressing climate change coupled with advancing equity are the 2 pillars of what we call transportation justice. Next slide, please. There is no one step we can take to heal our planet. Climate change is complex, and our vision for stopping the climate crisis must be too. Driving our approach is the commitment to transportation justice that I just outlined. Given transportation's outsized contribution to climate change, one of the most important things we can do is reduce the miles that people drive. This is represented here with arrow 1. VMT stands for vehicle miles traveled and is one of the most common measures of the amount of traffic in an area. Cars and other vehicles will continue to have a role in our transportation system of the future. They will remain important for people who travel long distances and move freight. The key is to make the remaining vehicles cleaner. If we do this, we can dramatically reduce the harmful tailpipe emissions. That is the second element in our vision. That way, the way our city is built and organized has a huge influence of whether people get in their cars or not. That is why we must pay attention to planning a city, which is a city of communities, where convenient and attractive walk and bike connections exist, and connections between those different communities have a robust transportation system. That is strand 3 of our vision. Finally, we are seeing more and more with the climate crisis already contributing to more severe weather patterns and related phenomena such as wildfires. Damage has already been done, and we need to do something to make our city and communities better able to be resilient in the face of these new and unpredictable changes to our natural environment. I'd like to now briefly turn to some of the concrete strategies we're pursuing to make this vision a reality. Next slide, please. Are walking and biking and taking transit in Portland safe, quick, and convenient? If the answer to this question is a clear yes, then we can make significant progress on getting people out of their cars and reducing greenhouse gases. Our efforts to making those shifting modes the natural choice for Portlanders encompasses almost everything we do at PBOT. Just to cite a few examples. Through Vision Zero, we are investing millions of dollars a year to make our transportation system safer. With council support and with the partnership of TriMet, we are implementing the Rose Lane project to make transit faster and more reliable. Popular programs like Sunday Parkways and Safe Routes to School help people of all generations help them find a way to make a low carbon transportation lifestyle. And we are always on the outlook for sustainable technologies and innovations. That's why we've been so excited, for example, with the conversion of our Biketown fleet to an all e-bike system and the new neighborhoods in Portland, including parts of East Portland, that were included in the expansion, because it really does make e-bikes an attractive commute option, even for longer journeys. Next slide. As Andrea mentioned, the electrification of the country's vehicle fleet is something that's very important. Recently, we received some really strong momentum as General Motors said that it would phase out all gas-powered cars and trucks by 2035, and our neighbor to the south in California pledged to eliminate all gas-powered vehicles in 15 years, the sales of those. At PBOT, we welcome these and other signs of progress towards greater electrification as we've been proceeding in that direction for some time. Working with BPS, we have three goals. First is to identify and reduce barriers, including our own, for electrification. Second, facilitating market transformation. And third, filling the market gaps, especially within multi-family zones and developments. The concrete steps we're taking to meet these goals include partnering with PGE to pilot telephone pole mounted chargers to see if that might be an effective technology for public charging that doesn't take up a lot of space in the right of way. We've also set a new cord cover permitting program to improve safety for charging arrangements in low density residential zones and allowing cords to cross sidewalks or other parts of the street. As part of the electric vehicle readiness project, we're working with BPS to change certain zoning codes to provide households, especially those living in multifamily housing, with more transportation options. We're also assessing the demand and supply for public charging along our major streets with the goal of providing more public charging opportunities. Next slide. Safe and sustainable infrastructure, programs and policies that encourage low carbon practices, easy access to electric vehicles. These are all important tools in our climate toolbox. And we can amplify the impact of these tools by giving people an incentive to make climate friendly transportation choices. As other cities and jurisdictions have shown, price is one of the most powerful incentives that we have. Together with BPS, we have convened the Pricing Options for Equitable Mobility Committee, or what we call POEM. With representation from the city's key stakeholders, the committee is working on a set of policy proposals that can use price to encourage transportation behaviors that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I do want to emphasize the E in that acronym. Any pricing policies we institute cannot come at the expense of our most vulnerable communities, and they must help to correct inequities in our current system. For that reason, we have charged the committee with the mandate to put transportation needs of our city's historically underserved community front and center in their work. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of the strategic and wide-ranging work PBOT has underway to support our work to confront the climate crisis. We look forward to additional opportunities to discuss specific budget-related requests and related opportunities to further advance this crucial and urgent work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director Warner, and thank you to PBOT for your partnership on this climate work that we're doing together. Next slide, please. Finally, I'd like to close with a reminder that we know delaying climate action will be more costly for the city, for businesses, residents, and the community. The good news is that climate and racial equity are two top priorities for the Biden administration, and we will start to see that translate into policies and resource allocations. Portland needs to be well positioned for the upcoming federal economic stimulus bills that will invest in clean energy transformation and electrification investments, and be eligible for these investments with our own required local matches. Beyond that, we hope to work with City Council to identify new ways to resource the climate leadership action you aspire to see across the city and put Portland back in a leadership position nationally and globally on climate action. Next slide. And with that, that concludes our presentation. We're happy to take your questions. Thanks so much for the time.
All right, colleagues, any questions at this point? A couple, Frida, then Commissioner Hursti.
Okay, listening to about the climate and the fires, this recent batch of wildfire we've had that caused such dense smoke within the Portland area, having discussion with other homeowners, I discovered that the fact that my husband and I over the years had winterized or tried to make our home more energy efficient with windows and insulation, et cetera. And one of the byproducts turned out to be where other friends of mine who didn't go to the extent we went, they were dealing with the smoke in their homes. I didn't smell it at all unless I opened the door. So I know we have some programs on winterization. The county does some of those things. Are you looking at expanding those programs? Because I see a byproduct is that it does help when we can't avoid the smoke in the air, at least for the especially lower income families that or seniors who can't afford to do that type of winterization. I just think more dollars are needed to help get them ready, and it would have the byproduct of saving energy as well as health issues that come with that.
Yes, thank you, Frida, for the question. Absolutely, that's one of the one of the programs for the Portland Clean Energy Fund is to increase energy efficiency, particularly for low-income and BIPOC communities, and that'll have kind of many benefits, including saving energy, reducing cost burdens, but also helping to make homes and apartments more safer when we have these wildfire risk events. There's also, we need to really look at how do we improve the resiliency of East Portlanders. We find that people living in East Portland have less access to air conditioning or less access to energy efficient homes, and there are greater risks because of they have higher incidence of asthma and other health risks that make them at greater risk to wildfire events. And so we really need to kind of take this approach and looking at how are we protecting our community, particularly as the data is telling us that exposure to wildfire smoke is much more acute and risky to people's health than the exhaust and emissions that we're trying to tackle from the vehicle emissions. So that is absolutely a priority of ours. PSEF gives us a tool, and there's more that we'll need to do beyond that.
Thank you.
Thank you both for that incredible presentation. And clearly both of you put a lot of thought into how you were going to frame this conversation. And I will say, as far as PSEF is concerned, BIPOC communities will be leading that effort. And I look for opportunities for the city to actually partner with BIPOC communities that are leading the charge around the PSEF dollars. I think because we haven't put the first grants out yet, I think there's a lot of anticipation about what will happen as we start seeing these projects come online, and that we are starting to build the capacity of these BIPOC-owned nonprofits and businesses to actually lead in this effort. So I guess my excitement is around the city being able to be a good partner as community starts actually putting these projects on the ground and starts implementing some of these really creative opportunities that we have. As the commissioner in charge of transportation, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the $4 billion in improvements that need to be made to our streets. And what scares me about that is that we'll only bring our streets up to a fair condition. If we are talking about investing in our future, people have to have sidewalks. They have to have streets that actually won't harm them if they walk on them or roll on them. And so I think what we as a council are faced with is investing for the future, but also making sure that we do our due diligence about what we have currently and how to make that more functional. And we're not going to solve this issue today, but I would be remiss if I didn't put that in the midst of really the conflicting values that we are confronted with. Our city values and the financial dependence that PBOT, as an example, has on fossil fuel taxes and parking garage fees compels us to think creatively about a new funding source that will actually move us into the future. We cannot continue to encourage people to use the things that we know are having a huge impact on our climate if we're moving towards the future. So I agree with what Director Durbin said, which is we actually have a federal government that believes in science. It believes that climate change is real, and it believes in a sense of urgency that we all have in Portland about how we really impact that. So we are not faced with easy choices when you have a $500 million budget, but it's so reliant on the dirty things that we are trying to get away from. I feel the sense of urgency in looking for other funding mechanisms that help us move to the future. And maybe I'll stick a pin in it by saying, I don't think that PBOT is unique and that we're depending on resources that in fact don't move us into the future. It actually compels us to continue bad practices of the past. And as a council, we're gonna have to struggle with that as we move forward in this budget and beyond. So thank you both for an incredible presentation.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. Commissioner Ryan, then Commissioner Mapps, then Commissioner Rubio, then Mr. Rogers. We'll start with Commissioner Ryan.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Director Durbin and Director Warner. 2 questions, one for each of you. Director Durbin, I was looking for something that I know is probably you think about a lot, and that is the plan where the city makes a big transition away from internally, away from fossil fuels to, say, electricity with our fleet. And so can you tell me where that plan is? Let's see, kind of to contrast that earlier with Dr. Smith, I was looking for more plans that have us facing outward to the residents. And I think on this one, I want to ask, what's our plan internally so that we can walk our talk when we expect such things from the rest of the residents of the city. So can you give me a little bit of information on that? And if I missed it in the presentation, I apologize.
No problem. Absolutely. And I'll just say, and I'll actually pass it to Director Reinhardt, because OMF is really leading that work and doing a great job of, we have new energy, new staff that are bringing a lot of commitment and dedication to helping to transition our fleet. So it's an exciting moment, I think, for the city, but I'll let Director Reinhardt address it specifically.
Good morning, Council. Thanks for the question, Commissioner Ryan. For the record, Tom Reinhardt, Chief Administrative Officer. We do have a plan. We're lucky to have an excellent director of the Division of Asset Management, Maddie Souter, who used to work at PGE, building their asset management program. So Maddie has worked very hard in collaboration with Andrea and our private sector partners on the charging capacity, because as we all know, it's one thing to retrofit your fleet. It's another thing to actually have a infrastructure to be able to charge them. And that's the kind of market move we want to make. So we will send you and the full council through the CBO an update in writing on the plan. We have been working really hard on it, and I'm excited to say that PGE has been a good partner. But in short, yeah, we have responded to that aggressive timeline for council, and we are moving on that, and even hired a Green Fleet coordinator to make sure that someone is responsible day to day for that work.
Thank you, Director Reinhardt. I appreciate that. So Director Warner, I have a question for you, and it's when you're looking at your strategies, the mode shift. The one that I was most struck with was the target seemed really low for 2035 on work at home. Nothing like COVID to make you question that target. So currently in 2015, it was 7%. In 2035, it's 10%. So that just made me think a little bit. Was this some pre-COVID visuals that I'm looking at here? Curious.
Commissioner Ryan, absolutely. We are looking at reevaluating that since, our world is kind of turned upside down. So we certainly do think that would be appropriate as we, it takes sometimes years to kind of, pull all these pieces together. So certainly there's no doubt that number should be higher.
Okay, I'm happy to hear that. I figured that would be a little bit of a softball, and it would help the public know that we're aware that COVID happened and these targets might be a little bit off. And I think because we think COVID, the latest science is that it's more like the flu and there'll be vaccines. And I think people will always be a little bit more cognizant of physical distance, if you will, in winter months especially. So I know that with some of these other targets, I'm sure there'll be a COVID lens that you'll put on it, not just for today, but even long term. And we all look forward to seeing what this update will look like. Thanks.
Commissioner Mapps.
I had the same question that Commissioner Ryan had on the work at home. And so I think another way to get at this is to ask if we have any information on our CO2 outputs over the last year. Does having like half of Portlanders dramatically change the amount of pollution that we put in the air, or do we know?
Commissioner Mapps, we don't know that, we don't have that data yet. We will be updating the Multnomah County inventory on carbon emissions at the end of this fiscal year. But it's actually, we rely on data that's a year old. So we won't actually have 2020 data until 2021, into 2021, 2022. I think one of the complicating factors though is, yes, people working from home may decrease emissions from carpooling and driving. However, if people are at home in less efficient homes, if they have the heat up more, if they're using space heaters, it's complicated. But we'll have a better sense of that when we get the data, and certainly the data will inform our work.
Great, thank you.
Commissioner Ruby.
Thank you, and thank you, Andrea and Chris, for that really important. I feel very fortunate and very motivated to get to work with Director Durbin and the team at BPS on this important work. And I also want to acknowledge the tremendous work of all of our bureaus that have had connection to this, and also transportation, and also numerous community leaders, advocates, and groups for the accomplishments and the collaborations that have been achieving the work together thus far. These are the groups that have been at the forefront of this work for a very long time, and the partnership and the commitment, as Commissioner Hardesty mentioned, that role of the city is vital in all of this, and that will and must continue if we really want to make progress on our goals. And I'm very energized by the multiple conversations that have come from the work, from the Bureau's work on the healthy climate and clean air conversations over the last several weeks. My staff and I have personally engaged with multiple stakeholders across multiple sectors who all have a role in this work and the conversation, and whose engagement that we will be calling upon as we consider and shape these important next steps. And a lot of our conversations have generated even more commitments to engage and innovate ideas for us to explore. So now the real work begins to achieve these ambitious goals in this very short window of time that we have to significantly move the dial on these climate actions. And as Director Durbin stated, I love what she said about climate action is racial justice and is health justice and is economic justice. And we do need to invest more in this work. We do need to find those revenue sources, but it also takes us as a council to budget to our values with the budget that we do have as well, and the resources that we do have. And on that, I think we all agree that that is the work before us, and it's going to take all of us to do that in real and tangible ways. I also want to just appreciate our council and that we're all aligned around these goals, and that we must remain so and committed, not just in word, but in action and resources again, because we have this one shot, we have this window. And so if we need to do this to do it right and to get it done together. So again, just excellent presentation, and I look forward to the work.
Thank you, Commissioner Rubio. Next up is Mr. Rogers, then Mr. Cross.
Good morning. Let's say this right, Ms. Durbin, just a question. So when you guys keep mentioning East Portland, what are the boundaries for that? I know what it is as a resident, but not as like what is official city defined as East Portland. And two, I think the question was already asked. I was interested in just how the impact of everyone being home for the last year is affecting, all the levels, be it pollution, be it income from people being downtown more, from parking and all those sorts of things, and what kind of impact are they going to have long term. So those were kind of my two questions.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Rogers. East Portland, we have disparities east of 82nd and east of 205. Like, we need to really go deep in East Portland and focus on, there are different needs across East Portland. East Portland is not monolithic either. And we're really, BPS is working closely with East Portland communities and really trying to identify what the needs are and where we want to focus this work. And on the emissions tracking, kind of what do we learn from this last year? We'll have a lot more information once we collect the data, but we get data nationally and locally and from different partners, and there's always just a lag time to it. But we'll definitely, it'll be important data to share with City Council and with all of you.
Yeah, one thing I would add, Andrea, is that we are seeing kind of VMT, the vehicle miles traveled, coming back to close to the pre-COVID levels. Right when COVID started, there was quite a drop, but it's coming back. I think, and the thing that's a little concerning is it's coming back to those levels, but then transit ridership is down significantly. So, even though I think a lot of people are working from home, people are taking transit less, and that might be why they're driving more. So those are one of the trends we'll see. But as the more data comes in, as Director Durbin said, we'll be able to give you more information.
Okay, thank you.
And Terry Cross.
Thank you, Commissioner Durbin. I have a question. I think there's an opportunity with the lessons learned from COVID, and I really appreciate the discussion of the last few minutes about the complexity and the hydraulics, basically, of that and the way things shift. But I want to step back to the notion of the revenue side of this and how we might strategize with employers, with organizations around taking advantage of some of the lessons learned in COVID, and being intentional in the going forward with plans about keeping people home certain days of the week, even if we reduce the amount of time that it takes to travel.
What's the place you want to try? What's the name of the place?
So if we,
No,
you know,
no,
if
you're
we,
not on mute.
Yep.
No, one 122nd. What was that?
No, you're not on mute.
there he goes. Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. Well, I wonder if there's some strategies that we can enter into with regard to the way that this tax structure may reward or penalize the the amount of working from home. Just something down the future. But my question to you is, the kind of thinking going forward requires a lot of strategizing, a lot of partnering that isn't within the realm of day-to-day work. Does your bureau have enough money to invest in this future, if you're really going to strategize about what the answers are, and enter into the partnerships to reduce the impact on climate? It's going to be required to meet goals. Do you have the resources to invest in not necessarily the infrastructure, but it's kind of the R&D portion of this, as well as the partnering that needs to happen?
Thank you, Mr. Cross, for the question. We don't have enough resources to do the research development, the analysis, the policy development, the community engagement, the partnership work. We really don't have sufficient resources to do all of that and meet our goals. And really, and to your point about working in partnership, it's really critical as we pivot our work to be more community-centered, community-focused. We want to build tables in places where solutions come from that are, some of those solutions will be co-led with community. Some of those solutions will be community-led and community-driven, and some of them will be reliant on the city to really lift up and implement. So we're going to need everybody, and as well as the private sector. We're going to need lots of partners, and that kind of work does take staff time. It takes time. It takes resources to really help actually execute.
Very good. And I'll just chime in quickly. I also want to remind us we're doing fantastic work through our city bureaus, and Director Durbin, I want to particularly thank you for your leadership on this front. But I also want to remind us that the work we're doing at the local level is not taking place in a vacuum. And in fact, I represent the city in a number of areas nationally and globally around our climate action strategies. We're unifying, for example, the US Climate Mayors, C40, the Global Climate Covenant, and other efforts where the city of Portland is actually playing a leading role along with many, many other jurisdictions around the country and around the world to make a difference here.
Mayor, it looks like Show DeZono is trying to unmute himself. I don't know if that's true. If you could shake your head up and down, if that's so. Yes. Did you figure out how to unmute?
If not, Show, go ahead and just put it in the chat, and I'll go ahead and read what you put into the chat.
So Mayor, if I may, we do have two more presentations that we want to get to, though they're brief, but
Why don't you start, and I'll interrupt you if Show puts a question into the chat, if that's okay.
And I've, in the interest of time, I've asked other folks to as well put their questions in the chat, and we will facilitate follow-up.
Okay, thank you.
So I'd like to turn it over to our Chief Human Resource Officer, Kathy Bless, who will give us a really brief overview. We wanted to be sure before we dive into our Bureau presentations to do a quick sort of state of employees and employee update. And so I will turn it over to our Chief Human Resource Officer.
Thank you, Jessica. Good morning, Mayor, Commissioners, and citywide community budget advisors. I am Kathy Bless, Director of the Bureau of Human Resources, and I have appreciated the important conversations already taking place this morning in the leadership of Dr. Smith. I have the honor and privilege to come to speak to you today about the city's most valuable infrastructure and resource, our employees. So over the past years, our employees have faced many crises and still remain committed to delivering our services. Nearly every one of the city's employees have faced personal and professional challenges over the past year. The American Psychological Association has surveyed people across the United States since 2017 about stress and mental and physical impacts it has on our daily lives. When Stress in America survey was first conducted, the study showed various external factors that negatively affects stress levels, from economic downturns, impacts of racism, and political conflict. The 2020 survey results captured a significant shift and reveal that Americans have been profoundly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. These compounding stressors are having real consequences in the minds and bodies of all of us, including our employees. We also need to think about and address discrimination and racism. 33% of Stress in America participants cited discrimination as a significant source of stress in their life. This was an increase from 25% in 2019. Among people of color, 44% cited discrimination as a significant source of stress in their life, compared again to only 38% in 2019. These are significant changes headed in the wrong direction, and it is further proof that people are not being valued or feel safe among those who don't look like them. Locally, the Workforce Diversity and Retention Project identified experiences at work as one of the main decision factors a professional of color uses to decide whether or not to stay in our region. Within Oregon and Southwest Washington, some primary concerns were tokenism, lack of accountability among leaders, and chronic microaggressions or discrimination at work. Identifying a culture philosophy and building accountability within it is imperative. Our Asian American community is impacted as well. Time reports a 1,900% increase in racist violence against Asian Americans in New York in 2020. The location of this data is of little consequence because we know it's happening here as well. And we are hearing and feeling the impacts of hate speech and the prior administration's repeated rhetoric against China and COVID-19. We are called to be different and to support one another. Our employees, especially those who are parents or those who have other caregiver responsibilities, are bearing an enormous burden. Daily routines changed in an instant. Many schools and care options within Oregon remain limited today. Many essential workers were needed at the work site amidst many unknowns prevalent in the early stages of the pandemic, trying to balance work, keeping their families safe, and taking care of themselves. We transitioned employees not required at the work site to perform their job from home, asking them to commit to teleworking full-time virtually overnight, whether they were set up to do it or not. All of this occurred at a time when distance was critical and the normal support systems were not available. There is frustration from employees. We've asked them to work from home, provided some equipment, but don't have organized strategies or resources to ensure employees have the appropriate internet bandwidth, ergonomic chairs, or other work from home support. Employees feel that they are being asked to do more with less, and I encourage continued conversation and action regarding balance and support. Our own data reveals that employees are concerned about the impacts of the pandemic on the workforce, and employees describe this past year as exhausting, complex, overwhelming, humbling, and lonely. We worried about a national trend of women leaving their jobs and forced to make really hard decisions related to their non-work obligations. Our internal experience is different. I can share that fewer women have left the city during the pandemic. Overall, 8.2% fewer women left the city in the last 12 months. The percentage of women who voluntarily resigned in the past 12 months is about 25% lower than the average percentage of women who left voluntarily in the previous 5 years. And the percentage of women who retired in the past 12 months was 20% lower than the average in the previous 5 years. It is important to recognize the intentional work done this past year to be supportive of women and enable them to keep working during the pandemic in spite of the challenges they face as caregivers. This is strong evidence of how important continued advocacy will be. We need to create systems and policy that support caregivers and parents within the workforce. We are also worried about our employees of color. Overall, 1.4% more people of color left the city in the last 12 months. The percentage of people who voluntarily resigned was 3.9% higher than the average percentage of those who resigned in the previous 5 years. And the percentage of people of color who retired was significantly higher than the average of the same group who also retired in the previous 5 years. The convergence of this pandemic and social justice has called us to show up differently, be present, and change. We must eradicate disparate impacts for our employees who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. The solutions require a plan embedded in the city's adopted values, strong alliance with OEHR and equity managers, and within a workforce culture philosophy. Otherwise, we will continue to move in the wrong direction. We know there are disproportionate COVID-19 burdens leading to more deaths amongst our Black, Indigenous, people of color in the United States. Neighborhood and physical environment, health and healthcare, occupation and job conditions, income and wealth all contribute to these community risk factors. Our commitments to eradicate institutional and systemic racism is crucial. And as we mourn the 500,000 plus American lives lost to COVID-19, we must also allow ourselves and each other to acknowledge who and what has been lost. We must take time and space to grieve lost connections, daily routines, face-to-face interactions with family and friends, our own sense of security in our lives, and then we need to come together, restart, and move forward. I believe we remain hopeful. It may be different depending on whether you are a baby boomer, Gen X, or Gen Z. In fact, the Gen Z group, our youngest entering the workforce, is the least hopeful. Ensuring we have strategies to engage, develop, and connect is incredibly important for the well-being of this group. It is critical to not let our guard down, become complacent in our support, and to ensure current strategies remain in place and provide a roadmap far beyond any expectation or perceptions that life returns to normal. Oregon Healthy Workforce Center's Dr. Leslie Hammer reaffirms the strategies City of Portland has implemented and continues to work on. And those strategies include providing flexibility at work that helps people to do their jobs while still being able to juggle the new stressors and responsibilities in their lives, such as their child's education. Providing support is critical. This can be emotional support through one-on-one check-ins or by reducing someone's workload to essential tasks. This also applies to coworkers who can support each other by checking in and approaching each other with empathy. Providing clear communication to employees and supervisors about expectations, support resources, and new policies that respond directly to impacts created by the pandemic. And that all leaders should not expect work to continue at the same level as before the pandemic, and help employees prioritize what work is critical and what can wait. The pace of work is impacting our families and our caregivers. In thinking about resilience and connectedness, a few things come to mind. Internal infrastructure is our most precious.
Excuse me, can I stop you for a second? There's some crackling in the background that's really making it difficult to hear. Am I the only one that's hearing the background noise? No one else is hearing it?
I hear it as well, Commissioner. It sounds like it may just be the microphone. itself. It sounds like a little bit of feedback.
Thank you, Mayor. I was thinking maybe I had lost my mind. I noticed, Kathy, that you're showing up in two spots. Is that part of the problem?
I don't know. Is that better? Okay. I'm sorry for that. I tried to be respectful of kind of the background noise in my own home.
It's much
thank you.
Kathy, it is not better. We made it worse.
I cannot hear you now.
Wait.
So can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good. Go.
Okay. I'm just going to finish up my last remarks and then we can go from there to try to figure out my sound. So internal infrastructure is our most precious commodity. Without supporting internal infrastructure of the city, there is risk in the external success of council's priorities. Mental health and access to a diverse and robust provider network will be a structural imperative to recovery and ongoing well-being. We will need new celebrations and traditions within our city's bureaus when it is safe to do so, like celebration days when bureaus have all employees in, provide intentional training, and connect and build relationships. On a much broader scale, we need to ensure there is a grand reopening celebration of the Portland building. While it seems like a lifetime ago, we were all excited about moving into the building and celebrating the enormous effort it took to reimagine our work. The grand opening was scheduled last March, the very week we had to send many employees home due to the escalating threat of COVID. We are now required to reimagine our work again, and it will be important to acknowledge not only the return of activity, but to the business of connectedness of City Hall and the Portland building. Getting it right moving forward would be essential. Thank you very much for your time this morning, and I'm happy to take any questions or discuss further.
All right.
I'm going to figure out my sound.
It sounds much better now. Commissioner Hardesty, I don't know if she can hear you, but you can try.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Director. I'm very grateful for that presentation. When you talked about that we lost less women than the national number stated, you also talked about that it was a larger percentage of women of color. And I know the city council last year passed a resolution that allowed for flexibility for caregivers if they needed to either share their 40-hour week or if they needed to work less hours. At the time, we asked for you to collect data on how this impacted different segments of our workforce. So I'm hoping as we move into budget, you have some data that you can share with us about if this resolution did not work for women of color, why not? And what would we need to change to ensure that they have the same opportunities as other workers at the city of Portland to be able to take advantage of that opportunity? I've actually had a few meetings where people said their supervisor didn't share that they had this opportunity to really reimagine how they would operate, especially during the variety of crises we've had last year. So I am really curious as to if we continue to pass policies that have a disparate outcome, then what's our procedure for going back and changing that policy so that it actually does have an appropriate outcome for all city workers versus just a small segment of them?
Thank you very much for the question, Commissioner Hardesty. We have been collecting a number of pieces of data. One thing that I do want to just make sure that you understand about the data. The data with regard to women was related to all women who work in the city of Portland, including women of color. The retention rate drop was for all people of color. That was not specific to women. And so I am happy to make sure that your office and all offices have the data that this is all based upon.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So I know these are all extremely important topics. We are approaching the end of our first day. So I'm going to ask as well if folks have additional questions for Kathy to please put it in the chat, and we will facilitate follow-up. And then I'm going to turn it over to Director Mike Myers to lead us in a conversation around the ECC, and ask that Christina pull up the presentation for the ECC, please.
Thank you, Director Kennard. Okay. Good morning, Mayor and Council. For the record, my name is Mike Myers, a Director for Portland Bureau of Emergency Management. You may also know us as PBEM. Today, I will be speaking in relation to the Emergency Coordination Center budget. You'll know that as the ECC. After I provide an overview, you will hear from Katie Wolf, the ECC Manager, and then Sheila Craig, the ECC Finance Section Chief. As you know, PBEM is scheduled for our Bureau presentation on March 18th. We will discuss the Bureau specific performance needs and improvements at that meeting. Normally, a city is not in a state of emergency. During normal operating times, PBEM staff are working diligently on response planning such as earthquake or natural hazard mitigation planning. When emergencies do occur, like sudden winter weather or minor flooding, the emergency lasts for a few days at most, and rarely physically or virtually do we occupy the Emergency Coordination Center. However, since early March 2020, PBEM has been operating the ECC under full activation. Dozens and dozens of city staff from across the city have shifted their work to the ECC. We've called on neighborhood emergency teams to fill critical volunteer roles. We've established contracts with community-based organizations and vendors to fill specific needs for our residents. As you are aware, under Title III of City Code, the Disaster Policy Council convenes during an emergency. They convene to advise the mayor on policy matters pertaining to management of the emergency. The DPC has met numerous times during this last year. We also established a COVID-19 coordination team that for weeks met daily to respond to rapidly changing events more nimbly. This team still meets regularly today. Thank you, Sonia Szymanski, Tom Reinhardt, Kathy Bless, for your leadership on this team over the past year. Through all this coordination, let me just highlight a few of the actions taken last year. Prior to full community spread of COVID, Portland Bureau of Emergency Management planning team members began reviewing the city pandemic framework. This framework is being utilized today. The City of Portland Bureau of Technology Services began maximizing the number of workforces that can perform their duties via telework. We identified essential personnel who must report to duty during an outbreak and those that can telework. We established a support program for those that cannot telework and are essential. These included being flexible with human resource policy and easing work restrictions. We worked closely with critical service bureaus such as water, environmental services, transportation, police, and fire. These services had to remain open and operational. This included medical surveillance, special protective measures, and employee support. As community transmission began to grow, and in the absence of a national effort, we worked closely with Multnomah County Public Health and re-emphasized avoiding contact with sick people. We promoted the practice of proper hand hygiene and cough, sneeze etiquette. We communicated to personnel how and when to report illness and seek care for potential influenza-like illness. We increased workplace cleaning routines and began an awareness poster campaign within city buildings. We purchased cleaning supplies in preparation for a sustained outbreak and continued to seek additional supplies for the long term. We instituted a personal protective equipment posture for high personnel such as police and fire. We held labor management meetings to assure consistent and adequate messaging. We stood up a joint information system, and we established a crisis communications team. We held regular update meetings for directors and started regular employee communications via weekly emails. We assured the city website is accurate and updated and provided speaking points to council and elected officials to use for public interactions. And as the outbreak continued to grow and spread, we communicated to employees regarding travel to affected communities and advised employees of the risk. We began discussing the cancellation of city travel to affected areas to limit risk to city personnel and begin to encourage telework for those with the capability. We encouraged flexible sick leave options for employees and reduced oversight of sick leave use. As the spread became sustained, We began planning to limit public access to critical city facilities and canceling large public gathering events within the city limits. We began to exercise continuity of operation plans and forecasted contingencies for workforce reductions. We instituted call triaging for police and fire response via Bureau of Emergency Communications, and we delivered thousands of dollars in aid relief, household assistance, and food assistance to those in need. And during all this, other emergencies occurred. We had a record wildfire season. We had a record winter storm, and we had record protest activity. I want to take time and thank the mayor's office, the commissioners, the Disaster Policy Council, and the City Budget Office for their support in funding the ECC. The work being done is unprecedented, and the good things we are doing are tangible. We still have several months to go, but with vaccine production ramping up and shots getting into arms, we can see light at the end of the tunnel. I'd like to turn it over to Katie Wolf, who will discuss current operations in the ECC.
Director Myers. Good morning, City Council and Budget Committee members. I am Katie Wolf, Portland's Emergency Coordination Center Manager. The City of Portland uses a racial and disability equity lens in all services, layering that with consideration for intersectionality of identities, lived experiences, and needs. The COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately impacted communities of color, low-income workers, people experiencing houselessness, the elderly, and people with disabilities. So the ECC team recognized that the government cannot fill community needs alone. Portland's residents of color, immigrant and refugee groups, and people with disabilities often find community and support through community-based organizations or CBOs. Over the past year, newer and smaller community-based organizations and informal grassroots mutual aid groups have emerged. The ECC team has tirelessly found ways to partner and invest in these kinds of organizations. The breadth of the ECC's work is too much to cover today, but I'll cover a couple highlights about food security, mutual aid groups, and communications. Through the delivery of 7,717 preloaded debit cards, the ECC has supported the food security initiatives of at least 45 community-based organizations, 8 grassroots organizations, and 24 Sun schools, whose missions range from offering multiple days' worth of food to students and families of students to helping underserved youth realize their full potential. One essential component of this work is the JVIC, or Joint Volunteer Information Center, which is a partnership between the City of Portland and Multnomah County, established to distribute essential resources and support emerging and grassroots organizations and leaders in communities that are typically underserved by government. Throughout the pandemic, the JVIC has coordinated weekly deliveries of household supplies like toilet paper, masks, hand sanitizer to over 80 CBOs. Over the past year, our food box delivery program adapted boxes to meet cultural or dietary needs. The ECC team coordinated 39,382 food boxes delivered through Hood to Coast. We recently contracted with the grassroots organization Equitable Giving Circle to deliver produce from Black, Indigenous, and Latinx farmers to communities of color and homebound residents. Although cash assistance is crucial, there are other ways to support organizations. Over the past year, the ECC has been supplying free paper products to the community group Free Hot Soup, whose mission is to provide food to those who need it. The ECC also pays for storage space for the group Fires Igniting the Spirit, a grassroots group that supplies Native families with food and household supplies. These efforts reflect the city's ongoing commitment to center equity and work towards building community trust. An example of our communications and outreach work is the Do Your Part posters with pandemic health and safety measure messaging. Staff and neighborhood emergency team volunteers distributed more than 15,000 posters throughout the city, including to 60 culturally specific grocers, numerous community-based organizations, and gathering places. Employing language access and universal design best practices, the posters include simple graphics, plain language, and were translated into more than 20 languages. We're about to do this all again with an updated version of the poster. So a quick note on the temporary outdoor emergency shelters. I'm sorry, you can go to the next slide, please. These are in the process of being transferred to the county's purview. So our intent is to discontinue funding of the next, after the fiscal year. So you note these are some of the new service, or some of the current services, I should say, that we've been offering. And on the upcoming side, you will see vaccine support. We're adding a new operation together on top of everything we're doing. Building on the foundation that Portland Fire and Rescue has laid over the past year with bringing COVID testing opportunities to communities of color, The ECC team will be supporting a new drive-through clinic in East County to serve populations that experience the highest barriers to access. Partnering with Multnomah County and community-based organizations, we will serve specific underserved and marginalized communities with the goal to stand up operations by the end of this month and help our county and state meet our goal to vaccinate as much of our community as we can by early summer. Not only will the community partners help us make the clinic site more friendly and familiar, there will be opportunities for city staff and for our volunteers to help as well. COVID has brought a lot of uncertainty to our planning, so I can't foresee how long the ECC will need to remain activated or how long we'll be able to sustain this effort. The need for assistance will continue long after people are vaccinated. We may not be able to keep the ECC going forever, but we will have to find a way to maintain what we've built. So now I'd like to turn it over to our Finance Chief, Sheila Craig Black, to cover the details of our budget request for the rest of 2021, and I believe she's joining by phone.
Good morning. Thank you, Katie.
Next slide,
My name is
yeah.
Sheila Clark, the City of Portland's Grants Manager and the ECC Finance Chief. And hopefully everyone can hear me. In lieu of submitting
Yes,
we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. In lieu of submitting a decision package for the ECC's response activity, we submitted a budget memo outlining what we believe to be some of the expenses that the city is projected to incur through the end of the calendar year. At the time we wrote the memo, we weren't sure if there would be additional federal relief funds coming our way. We now know that the American Rescue Plan Act includes local relief funds, but there are still unknowns like how long will the ECC remain activated? How will ARPA funds be prioritized by council? What of the $3.7 million of expenses that the city will submit to FEMA get approved for reimbursement? When will FEMA's disaster declaration end? And we learned in a meeting this morning that it is projected that will potentially end on September 30th, 2021. Since we still do not know some of the answers to these questions, we have outlined some of the expenses that the council should anticipate as part of the city's ECC COVID-19 response. Walking through the priority areas we are anticipating: $250,000 in baseline expenses related to citywide return to work initiative, including change management, facility adaptations, and PPE. If the ECC were to remain activated throughout 2021, then we would need an additional $700,000 to maintain the same staffing level and operational support. In addition, if we were to maintain our current level of hygiene stations, the city would need an additional $1.2 million to maintain the same level of service. As Katie mentioned, the JVIC provides both food security and community support programs. To continue these efforts after June, this would require an additional allocation of $1.8 million. And lastly, we may need funding for vaccine support programs. We will continue to maximize federal programs like FEMA to reimburse these expenses, but not all of these expenses are reimbursable. Regardless, we'll need to have budget appropriated toward these expenses until federal funding like FEMA is approved. And now we can open it for questions.
Colleagues, any questions? Not seeing any at this particular point. All right, here's one. Commissioner Hardesty has a question.
Thank you, Mayor. I actually have more of a comment. I just wanted to take this opportunity to really appreciate Katie Wolf and Mike Myers, the leadership that they've shown through the multiple crises that we've had over the last year is nothing short of just phenomenal. Katie, you have just been such a steady rock. And Mike Myers, that goes without saying for you, you two as a team has just been absolutely phenomenal to watch your leadership, to watch your compassion and your empathy for the people that are suffering in our community. I just don't have the words to tell you how much I appreciate you both and the incredible work that you've done over this last year. Without you, there is no way the city of Portland would have been so responsive so quickly and so compassionately. So thank you both. I don't get too many opportunities to have you both in the same room in public. So forgive me embarrassing you both, but I just had to do that today. So thank you both.
Commissioner, thank you for the kind words, and really a lot of credit goes to Katie and her leadership of the ECC. Just been absolutely phenomenal. And I think everyone on this call knows we have 100 or more city staff, more than 100 city staff that have given up their day jobs and come into the ECC just to pour their heart out. And it's hard work. This is a huge, I've been in the business for 34 years and I've never managed an incident this large for this duration. And so for people, coming from different bureaus within the city, Sheila Craig has been there with us from the beginning as the ECC Finance Section Chief. Jian Kim, who's on the line, has just been extraordinary work. I mean, we could go on and on. So I just really, really thankful for the team. And I wanted to appreciate the mayor also last week coming in on the anniversary and thanking the team with you and Bobby Lee being there. It was important to hear from you both. So yeah, thank you, Commissioner. A lot of credit to Katie Wolf, but a lot of credit to city staff, volunteers, community-based organizations, that big and small, volunteers, net teams. It's just been the Multnomah County Public Health. It's been an extraordinary effort. So thank you.
Frida has a comment or a question.
Just a comment. I actually want to thank the ECC. They worked with EPAP to identify organizations, smaller organizations in East Portland, so they could get out gift cards and others help to those people who normally don't connect with the larger organizations. And I think it's forgotten that often many of our people of color and our minority groups aren't connected with community organizations to even know to get help. So I think it's important to look at how are alternative ways to get the information out. But I did appreciate their efforts, and it was really helpful for many of our residency in East Portland.
All right, Director Kennard, looks like we have 4 minutes.
So I want to say thank you to all of our presenters and thank you to everybody that joined us today. This is a good preview, I think, of what is to come. There's a lot of really important material that we're going to be diving into, and we will do our best to make sure presentations provide just the right level of information to get you engaged, but keep you at a relatively high level so we prioritize our time for discussion that is going to get the council members the information that they need to make the important decisions ahead. So today, as you know, is focused on our COVID-19 response and the response values framework. We intentionally grounded the conversation that way. We will be moving to bureau budgets and conversations next, but we'll try to always pull back and come back to these values, as well as integrate a conversation, intentional conversation around those 3 key shared priority issue areas. So next up, we'll reconvene on Thursday at around 2 o'clock, not around 2 o'clock, at 2 o'clock. We'll start with the auditor's office, who is going to come speak with you about her budget and her budget proposal. And then we will have presentations from a number of bureaus that provide city support services. If there are any questions or needs in the meantime, please feel free to reach out to me directly or my assistant director, Christy Owen. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Mayor Wheeler, to close us out.
All right, very good. Thank you, everyone. We actually got through an incredible amount of material today, some fantastic presentations, great questions and comments from all. And I'm going to give you back 2 extra minutes. We are adjourned.